Hello, my name is Jaru. Today I'm talking about Deltarune. There will be major spoilers for both Deltarune and Undertale, so please play them both before watching this. This video is the 5th in a series, so I highly recommend you check out my previous videos in order to get some important context. This video will consist of me discussing what is arguably the most important character in all of Deltarune, the Roaring Knight. I will be discussing all of the potential candidates for who this knight might be, while also giving my thoughts on who I think is the most probable. And to be clear, when I say all potential candidates, I mean all reasonable candidates. I will not include generic, nameless characters like Frogget, and I won't include similarly generic characters like Tasque, but if a character has a confirmed name and are more significant to the plot than Jigsaw Joe, then I'll probably discuss them in this video. That includes Undertale characters who have yet to appear in Deltarune, such as Papyrus, Chara, and Gaster. Minor NPCs with next to no characterization, like this clam girl or this rabbit girl, won't be included in this discussion, as there's nothing I can really say about them. And of course, it wouldn't be a Jaru video if I didn't discuss some insane theory of mine, so at the very end of this video, I will give you my very own theory regarding who and what the knight truly is. And spoiler alert, you've definitely never heard my knight theory anywhere else before. For starters, let's discuss everything we know about the Roaring Knight at this point in time. The knight was first introduced in Chapter 1 by Sham, who mentions that a strange knight appeared recently. This knight is responsible for upsetting the balance of power in the Card Kingdom, as 3 of the kings were locked up shortly after the knight's arrival. Sham then has this strangely worded line where he says that, quote, "the remaining king put him and his strange son into power." This line has multiple interpretations due to its confusing wording. The most likely interpretation is that the him in this sentence is referring to the Spade King, and the strange son is Lancer. However, there are other ways to interpret this line, which we will discuss later in the video. The next time we hear mention of the knight is from the 3 kings who mentioned being imprisoned by the knight. Shortly after, we hear more in the battle against the Spade King. He mentions that he will shatter Kris's heart to pieces by the knight's will. This could be his way of saying that the knight specifically wants Kris dead, but it could also just be that the Spade King wants Kris dead and that he's taking action out of loyalty to the knight. He goes on to say that the Darkners have found fresh purpose thanks to the appearance of the knight. He mentions that the knight pulls the fountains from the earth and that these fountains are holy. An interesting choice of words given that the creation of the fountains will bring about the angels' heaven. The king then says that flooding the world with darkness will allow the Darkners to rule the world. Given that Rousey later states that creating these fountains would turn all the Darkners into stone, that would seem to suggest that either Rousey is lying to us, the Spade King was lied to by the knight, or the Spade King just leapt to conclusions similar to how the Queen leapt to conclusions in Chapter 2. Given that she didn't know about the roaring, it's probable that the Spade King doesn't know either. The only other time we hear about the knight in Chapter 1 is after defeating Jevil. If you beat him non-violently, then he says that, "From now, a nightmare will awaken in your hearts, in the shadow of the knight's hand." If you instead beat Jevil with violence, he says, "The hand of the knight is drifting forward. Soon the queen returns, and hell's roar bubbles from the depths." The mentioning of hell in the context of the knight seems to further tie the knight to the angel from the prophecy and to the general religious symbolism surrounding the fountains. Also, both lines place emphasis on the knight's hand, which seems to be a recurring motif. At the very least, this confirms that the knight has hands, which does actually narrow down the candidates a fair amount. As for hell's roar bubbling from the depths, we know that the apocalypse from Rousseau's prophecy is known as the Roaring, and that the night is known as the Roaring Night. So it's probable that hell's roar is referring to that. In addition, I suspect that when it says from the depths, it's probably referring to whatever lies behind these doors south of town. The use of the word bubbles implies water, and Onionsan says that they have heard some old song from beneath the lake. This could be suggesting that there is some sort of underground facility that runs below the hometown, and Onionsan is hearing music coming from some chamber in that facility. Jevil clearly connects the night with this facility and compares it to hell, although what this means in the greater narrative, I'm not sure. Something worth noting is that upon returning to Sham and asking him about Jevil, he has this to say. One day he met a strange someone, and since then he began to change. He started saying bizarre things that didn't completely make sense, but didn't completely not make sense either. Soon he began to see the world as a game, and everyone as its participants. As the court mage and his only companion, I was forced to lock him away. Or rather, lock us all away, in his own words. Since that time, the strange words he said have stuck inside my cotton, and my view of this world has become darker yet darker. This darker yet darker line is a direct reference to the journal entry written by W.D. Gaster in Undertale, which seems to imply that the strange someone Jevil mentions here is either Gaster or someone tied to Gaster. However, the reason I bring this up is because when talking about the night, Sham highlights their name in red, and yet when talking about this strange someone, he does not do this. Furthermore, Jevil meeting this strange someone and getting locked away is specifically implied to have occurred a long time ago, while the night arriving is stated to be a recent occurrence. As such, it seems likely that the Roaring Night and the strange someone that Jevil met are not the same person. Sham does refer to both characters as strange, so maybe they are connected in some way, but still, I don't think they are one in the same. The next time we hear someone discuss the night is in Chapter 2, when it is brought up by the Sweet Cap'n Cakes. They mention that the queen became worse after the Dark Fountain showed up, in that she wouldn't stop talking about the night and the fountain. Note that they refer to the night as an it here. This could just be their gender-neutral term for the entity due to them not knowing anything about it, but you could interpret this as proof that the him being used in Sham's line was not, in fact, referring to the night. The next we hear of the night is from these butlers in Queen's Mansion, who are watching a video of the night creating the fountain. They say that the night created the fountain and this world, that it might be more powerful than Queen, and that this video shows the night creating this fountain by its own hand. Once again, we see this emphasis on the knight's hand, and once again, we see the knight referred to primarily as an it. After this, it's not until Queen's battle that we hear the knight mentioned again. In her initial battle, Queen mentions that the knight is the one who created this world, but she goes into far more detail afterwards. She says, "The night, the roaring night. Today it deigned to create this world. Reaching its long hand to the sky, it coursed its will into its blade, and made, thrusting the fountain from the earth. Unfortunately, the world they created is trapped within the confines of the library. If only we had a way to make more darkness, we might be able to cover the whole world. That is when I realized this power of the will, this power of determination. Is this not something that all Lightners possess? If one was simply determined enough, could not anyone create a dark fountain? So then, if the night has taken its leave, then I will simply make a new one." There is a lot to break down here. First of all, this is the first time that we hear the night referred to as the Roaring Night. Rousey later describes the apocalypse from the prophecy as the roaring, which suggests that the night is a harbinger of this apocalypse. Considering that the roaring is caused by creating dark fountains, which is the main thing the night has done, bringing about the roaring seems to be the night's goal. The queen didn't know about the roaring, and yet she still called the night the roaring night, which means the night likely referred to itself as the roaring night when it created the cyber world. This also may suggest that the queen actually met the night, which could potentially narrow down the candidates. Queen then mentions that the night created this world today. In the next line, we see further emphasis on the knight's hand, although this time they specifically describe its hand as being long. This is very important, as the more descriptions of the knight's appearance we get, the easier of a time we'll have narrowing down its identity. The queen also mentions that the knight created the fountain by coursing its will, aka its determination, into its blade. First off, this confirms that the knight uses a blade of some sort, and if this image the queen creates is accurate, then it would appear that the knight not only uses a knife, but also has either 4 or 5 fingers. Due to the abstract nature of this image, it's hard to tell exactly how many fingers are being depicted. If the straight lines represent fingers, then the knight has 5. But if this image is meant to be interpreted like this, then the knight has 4 fingers. I originally wrote this script with the assumption that the knight had 5 fingers, and then I had to rewrite the script once I realized that it might actually have 4. I was very annoyed. This next line didn't make a ton of sense to me at first, as it seemed like broken English. Why would Toby Fox have this random, fractured sentence in the middle of the Queen's monologue? But then I remembered where I had heard this strange phrasing before. There's another character who uses the word made in a strange way. Or rather, another character who uses the word making in a strange way. I'm of course talking about Spamton. During the weird route, upon fighting Spamton, he rants at you for betraying him and then gives you this line of dialogue. "No, I get it. It's you and that Hochi mama. You've been making, haven't you? You've been making hyperlink blocked, and now that you have your own supply, you don't need me." Honestly, you could spend a whole video just analyzing Spamton's bizarre dialogue, and you could spend another entire video trying to deduce what he's referring to when he says hyperlink blocked. Given what it means when a hyperlink is blocked on a computer, it's easy to assume that Spamton is trying to say something specific, but every time he tries to say it, he gets an error and it says hyperlink blocked instead. That said, I think it's clear that hyperlink blocked is usually used in a context in which it means something related to souls, determination, identity, freedom, or possibly just power. Of course, that's assuming that hyperlink blocked is replacing the word that Spamton actually wants to say. It's possible that when he says hyperlinked blocked, he is doing so intentionally. As such, much like his other bizarre dialogue choices, I think we could possibly interpret hyperlink blocked literally in order to guess what he means. The first word is hyperlink, which is composed of the prefix hyper and the noun link. Hyper means to go over, beyond, above, or excessively more than normal. For example, Asriel's most powerful move, the Hyper Goner, is an attack that can wipe out an entire timeline, so it makes sense that he'd use the hyper prefix. The next word, link, means a relationship between two things or situations, especially when one thing affects the other. As such, the literal interpretation of hyperlink is a connection between two things that goes beyond normal. Combine that with the second word, blocked, and it seems like Spamton wants to block some sort of unusual connection. Given that he is obsessed with cutting the strings that make him a puppet, it's likely that he wants the power of determination in order to block the link to whatever entity is controlling his fate. So, when he says that Kris also wants hyperlink blocked, it's likely because he can tell that Kris is also being puppeted by some other entity, and thus Kris also wants to block their own hyperlink. Point is, it's likely that both Queen and Spamton are referencing very similar things when using the words made and making. Specifically, they're likely referring to determination, as that's the power needed to create fountains, that's the power that can change fate, and that's the power that Kris is probably building inside of Noelle. I kinda got sidetracked a little to talk about Spamton, but to tie this all back to the Knight, we now know that the Knight is capable of wielding determination, which means that the Knight probably has a soul. Which means that the Knight is probably a Lightner. Which means that the Knight is probably a character we've met in the hometown of Deltarune. I say probably because, as we saw in Undertale, it is possible for an entity without a soul to wield determination. However, in Flowey's case, that was only possible because he had been injected with determination, and while there are a lot of similarities between Darkners and Flowey, I think it's safe to say that Darkners do not wield determination in the same way that Flowey did. That said, thanks to having Flowey as an example, we know that it is in fact possible for a soulless entity to steal souls and become more powerful as a result. So, Spamton did actually have the right idea. If he had succeeded in stealing Kris's soul, he likely would have been capable of entering the light world, despite not having a soul of his own, which is a scary thought. But it does show that, theoretically, a Darkner could be the Roaring Knight and be responsible for creating fountains if they somehow gained the soul or the determination of a Lightner. Recall that the Spade King adores the Knight despite hating Lightners, so that could be argued to be evidence that the Knight is not a Lightner. The only other notable details that we can find in the Queen's speech is the fact that she refers to the Knight with gender-neutral pronouns, and she mentions that the Knight has taken its leave. Unfortunately, we have no way of knowing if the gender-neutral pronouns mean anything, as she could just be using such terms because the Knight wears metal armor that conceals their identity and gender. Speaking of which, it is possible that the Knight wears the armor of a knight, and while this isn't confirmed, Kris gained armor simply by entering the Dark World, so a character doesn't necessarily need to own any armor in the Light World in order to gain the armor of a knight upon entering the Dark World. That said, if a character does own armor in the Light World, or owns something that the Dark World might convert into armor, that would certainly improve their chances of being the Knight. And with that, there's no further mention of the Knight thus far in Deltarune. That said, I do need to point out one other piece of evidence that should help us narrow down the candidates. Specifically, we know that the Knight created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain and the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. And while we don't know when the Card Kingdom was created, we do know when the Cyberworld was created. Quain specifically mentions that this dark world was created today, which narrows it down a little bit, but more importantly, Berdly and Noelle wind up in this dark world. It seems exceedingly unlikely that either of them would jump into a dark world the way Kris and Susie do, and since they're literally sitting at the table when the Dark Fountain is sealed, this suggests that they had sat down before the dark world was created. Furthermore, this closet specifically has text that says that a large person could fit in there, which seems to be hinting that the Knight was hiding in this room and created the fountain after Noelle and Berdly sat down. This is further supported by the fact that Rouse mentions sensing a dark presence and hurrying over, which implies that the dark fountain was created shortly after Kris and Susie left the castle town, as Rouse never mentions sensing such a presence beforehand. Considering Noelle is still very close to the entrance of the cyberworld when we find her, this further supports the notion that the fountain was created only a few minutes before Kris and Susie arrived. This suggests that the sequence of events went something like this. The knight enters the computer lab and hides in the closet. Noelle and Berdly enter the computer lab and sit down. At the same time, Kris and Susie enter the castle town and hang out for a minute. They then leave the castle town and start heading towards the library. The knight creates the dark fountain, tells Queen that it is known as the Roaring Night, and then quickly flees the computer lab. Queen analyzes her new situation and then enacts her plan to collect lighteners and create another Roaring Night. Rouse immediately senses the creation of a new dark fountain and hurries over to investigate. Kris and Susie then narrowly miss the night and enter the library. They then enter the cyberworld and stumble across a very confused Noelle, who is then captured by Queen. Rouse then catches up with the party. This seems to be the complete sequence of events. With this timeline established, we should be able to rule out a number of characters who are just in the wrong place at the wrong time to create the cyberworld dark fountain. So, with all that evidence on the table, let's discuss the potential candidates. Like I said before, I will be including all of the important named characters, even if they haven't actually appeared in the plot, which includes Darkners like Rouse, Lancer, and Spamton. Even though Darkners probably can't wield determination, they can steal souls, which means that, in theory, much like Flowey, a Darkner could create dark fountains if they manage to steal the soul of a Lightener. Since Toby Fox has introduced this plot device, we have to assume it's possible, and thus I will be including the Darkners in this analysis. Each character will be analyzed in 3 ways: means, motive, and opportunity. When discussing means, I will go over whether the candidate matches the physical description of the knight and whether they have the ability to create dark fountains. When discussing motive, I will go over whether a candidate could have any reason for bringing about the roaring, and if so, what that reason might be. And when discussing opportunity, I will go over whether they could have been in the right place at the right time to create the dark worlds. Oh, also, for each candidate, I will be ranking them in a tier list that represents how likely I think they are to be the knight. A tier means they are a compelling and reasonable option. B tier means they are a flawed but reasonable option. C tier means it's technically possible but dubious. D tier means it's extremely unlikely, while F tier means it's downright impossible for that character to be the knight. With all that preliminary stuff out of the way, I will now discuss in alphabetical order every single option within reason regarding the true identity of the Roaring Knight. First up is Alphys. Starting with means, as far as physical appearance is concerned, the knight has long arms while Alphys is smaller than Kris. She also isn't known to wear armor, although she is known to build robots, so maybe she could build some sort of mecha suit that she could disguise herself with while in the dark world. She is certainly known for being rather deceptive, so that's not completely outside her characterization, and she also has 4 fingers, which could be enough to match the knight. Alphys is a Lightener, so it is feasible that she could create a dark fountain, although whether she has enough determination to pull that off is debatable. She's not exactly a strong-willed person. She's also not known to wield a knife. In terms of motive, Alphys doesn't seem to be a religious type, so her wanting to bring about the angel's heaven seems unlikely, and while she has been known to cause problems for other people, it was always on accident, so it seems unlikely that she would try to bring about the end of the world. Admittedly, she does betray her people and help Frisk in Undertale, but to be fair, she was just helping an innocent child get home, so that's not exactly an evil act on its own. And while she may have scientific motivations for creating dark fountains, I think she's a bit too timid to pursue such an endeavor. As for opportunity, she definitely had the chance to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, as she literally works at the school, but given that the grand doors were left open and Ralsei could see the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain in the distance, it stands to reason that the knight likely knew about Ralsei's dark world existing inside of the supply closet. As such, it seems unlikely that Alphys would intentionally endanger Kris and Susie by sending them to the supply closet where she likely knows there's a dark world. Even if she is the knight, I don't buy that she would put any children in immediate danger, especially if that child belongs to Asgore, who she has a crush on, or to Toriel, who is probably one of the only people to treat her kindly, and is literally the person who got Alphys her teaching job. Furthermore, it is dubious if Alphys would have the chance to get to the library before Noelle and Berdly. We say goodbye to Alphys right here, walk down the hall, have a conversation with Noelle, and then she immediately departs for the library. Could Alphys, with her stubby legs, really get to the library before Noelle? Plus, we don't see Berdly, which implies he has already left for the library, so Alphys would have to beat him there and hide in the closet without him noticing her. Does she really have time to pull all this off? Well, it's debatable. I would argue against it, but it's not impossible. She does own a bicycle after all, and she is gone from her classroom during the time when this would all be going down. She later crashes into Undyne, which is implied to happen sometime after we enter the library, as prior to that point in time, Undyne was still clearing traffic and nobody had gotten hurt yet. As such, it could be that Alphys fled the library after creating the Dark Fountain and was in such a hurry to get away that she crashed her bike. But to be honest, none of that seems particularly in character for Alphys, and you could easily argue that her being with Undyne counts as an alibi in favor of her not being the knight. Also, if she really is the knight, then she is doing a shockingly good job of not hinting at that fact in her dialogue. As when you discuss the fact that you went to the library where she supposedly made this latest dark fountain, she doesn't panic or act suspicious, and instead just rambles about the anime reviews. The Alphys we knew from Undertale was a terrible liar, and you could easily tell when she was concealing something, so it seems unlikely that her dialogue would be so inconspicuous if she really was the knight. Overall, Alphys does not match the physical description of the knight, does not seem to have any reason to be pursuing the Roaring, and it's debatable if she had the opportunity to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. As such, I would say it's extremely unlikely that Alphys is the knight, which puts her in D tier. Side note, did anyone else notice that Asgore is the one who hires Alphys in Undertale, while Toriel is the one who gets her hired in Deltarune? That's a cool little detail. Next up is the annoying dog. The annoying dog has a shocking amount of evidence supporting it being, which makes him the only S tier option in this video. Next up is the king under the mountain, Asgore. Starting with means, Asgore definitely matches the physical description of the knight. He has 5 fingers, he has quite long arms, is known to wear the armor of a knight, and is known to wield various weapons both for combat and for gardening. It's highly probable that the worn dagger was a weapon given to Chara by Asgore, so it's entirely possible that Asgore could own such a weapon as well. Notably, the closet in the computer lab specifically says that a large person could easily fit inside, and there are very few people larger than Asgore. Also, I definitely say that Asgore has enough determination to potentially create a dark fountain, as he had the strength to govern his people for millennia in the Undertale timeline. In terms of motive, Toriel definitely seems to be the religious type, so it's feasible that Asgore is as well. As such, it's quite possible that he might have religious reasons to bring about the angels' heaven through the roaring. It wouldn't be the first time that Asgore has ended up as the main antagonist, despite having good intentions. Even without the religious angle, Asgore's life is in such shambles that he'd have plenty of reasons to want to shake things up. I mean, he's divorced, he has no house or bed, he's on the verge of losing his business, he's a disgraced former police chief, and his best friend is slowly dying in the hospital. Needless to say, things aren't exactly going well for Asgore, which could work as motivation for pursuing the roaring. In terms of opportunity, Asgore would have plenty of chances to enter the library and hide in the closet in the computer lab, but he would have much fewer opportunities to sneak into the school. Although, since his ex-wife works at the school, it's conceivable that he might know a thing or two about when the best time is to sneak in. That said, the one issue with Asgore creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is that he would likely have been spotted by Undyne upon leaving, who we know was directing traffic at the time. And given how he's her former boss, and a rather conspicuous character, you'd think she'd have something to say about that. Then again, Asgore is notably absent for the majority of Chapter 2. You can't even enter his flower shop. As such, you could argue that his absence is due to him being the knight. And unlike Alphys, Asgore would have no idea that Kris was one of the kids who keeps falling into these dark worlds. Although, that does bring us to the first major issue with Asgore being the knight. Why on earth would a kind-hearted man like Asgore create dangerous dark fountains in a school and in a library where children often frequent? Even if things are going terribly for him, we've seen Asgore at much lower points in his life, and he would never intentionally endanger a child like that. He felt deeply guilty about killing human children in Undertale, despite everything humanity had done to them, and in Deltarune, he'd have way less justification for putting kids in harm's way. This is the same man who dressed up as Santa Claus in Undertale and who was the police chief not too long ago. So from a purely character standpoint, I find it incredibly hard to believe that Asgore would risk the lives of these kids in his hometown. Overall, Asgore is a perfect match for the knight's appearance. He's certainly got the motivation to bring about the roaring, and he's given plenty of opportunities to make these dark fountains. However, endangering children seems so out of character for Asgore that I find him being the knight a hard pill to swallow. Also, that would make Asgore the primary antagonist for the second game in a row, which I don't really think Toby Fox would do. The impression I always got was that Asgore has to be at the worst possible point in his life before he'd be a threat to anyone. So, as it stands, I would say Asgore is definitely a feasible candidate, but not one that I personally think makes much sense. So, let's put him in B tier. Next up is the prince of the Dreamer household, Asriel. As for means, much like his father, Asriel has 5 fingers, long arms, and is known to use bladed weaponry. Admittedly, Asriel is not known to wear armor, but he is known to have a great deal of determination, so it's quite believable that he could create a dark fountain. In terms of motive, Asriel is arguably even more religious than Toriel, as Asriel would regularly go confess for Kris's sins, despite that not being a concept in their religion, and he was a member of the church choir. As it stands, with the exception of Father Alvin himself, Asriel has shown the most devotion to the angel religion out of any character in Deltarune, and thus he could have religious motivation to bring about the angels' heaven. That said, if we don't include the religious angle, there's not much incentive for Asriel to pursue such a goal. As far as we know, Asriel's life is pretty good, so it's hard to imagine he'd want to shake up the status quo. Even if he created the Dark Worlds in order to help his sibling in some way, that doesn't change the fact that Asriel is a pretty ethical person, and much like Asgore, I can't really imagine that he would endanger children by creating these dark fountains. As for opportunity, this is where it gets especially sketchy. Asriel, supposedly, isn't even in town, so if he really is away at college, then that would mean he literally couldn't be the knight. However, if that alibi is a lie and Asriel has secretly snuck back to town, then theoretically he could sneak into the school and create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. However, creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is a much more dubious affair. Not only would Asriel have to sneak in and out without being seen in the middle of the day, but he would also then have to hide his identity throughout the rest of the town in order to avoid revealing that he had come back from college. If there was some mysterious person hanging around town hiding their identity, wouldn't someone have noticed and commented on it? Overall, Asriel mostly matches the knight's description, could potentially have a religious motive for bringing about the roaring, and he could theoretically sneak around town creating fountains without being seen, but he is not known to wear armor, he is generally too ethical to endanger the lives of children, and he already has a fairly strong alibi due to him being supposedly away at college. Also, if Asriel was the knight, then that would make him the primary antagonist again, which, much like Asgore, I find to be a dubious prospect. As such, I'd say Asriel is technically an option, but an unlikely one, and thus ends up in C tier. Next is everyone's favorite alpha gamer, Berdly. As for means, this one is rather tricky, as Berdly doesn't really have fingers, so that part is already dubious. But as far as long arms are concerned, he is taller than Kris. In addition, he wears armor like a knight, he literally refers to himself as a knight, and he does technically use a bladed weapon, although it's not a knife. He also seems confident that he could create a dark fountain at the end of Chapter 2, so that part seems to check out. In terms of motive, Berdly very effectively presents his reasons for wanting to cover the world in darkness. He thought it would create a utopia for the smart people of the world. That part is fairly well laid out. The only issue is that, presumably, the knight is an ongoing threat, whereas Berdly has largely been neutralized as an antagonist by the end of Chapter 2. So if he really is the knight, then he'd probably have to possess a secret reason for wanting the roaring, now that he actually knows what it is. But based off his characterization, it feels like his character arc is largely complete. Of course, this could be a ruse on Toby Fox's part, but unless Berdly has hidden depths that we haven't even begun to understand, it seems like him being defeated so early in the game wouldn't really make sense if he actually was the knight. In terms of opportunity, Berdly is a student at the school, so he could certainly have had the opportunity to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. However, as far as the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is concerned, that part really doesn't add up. When the fountain is sealed, Berdly appears in the middle of the room, not in the closet. And if he had created the Dark Fountain, then Noelle would have seen him. Similarly, the Queen clearly saw, or heard, or possibly even met the Roaring Knight, and says that the Knight took its leave, which means that she, more so than anybody, should have been able to realize that Berdly was the Knight, especially after how long she spends in his company. Furthermore, the Spade King clearly had the opportunity to interact with the Knight, as the Knight is the one that put him into power, and with all due respect to Berdly, I can't really imagine the Spade King worshipping at the shrine of a pro gamer. I don't think the Spade King would have even a single ounce of respect for some know-it-all Lightner brat. Overall, Berdly calls himself a knight, dresses like a knight, has an established motivation to bring about the roaring, wields a bladed weapon, and he is seemingly capable of creating dark fountains. However, he doesn't have fingers, doesn't use a knife, has already had a character arc, has already been defeated, is not recognized by Queen, was in the wrong place to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, and is not the kind of person that the Spade King would respect. Oh, also, you can kill him in the Snowgrave route, and I don't think the Roaring Knight can be murdered in Chapter 2. As such, while not completely impossible, I find it extremely unlikely that Berdly could be the knight, and thus he ends up in D tier. Next up is Bratty. I can't believe I included her and Catti on this list, but here we go. In terms of means, she is not a knight, nor has she ever worn armor, and she's never used a weapon of any kind, including a knife. That said, she does have long arms, she has at least 4 fingers, and since she's an alligator, it could be argued that her scales are a form of natural armor. It's debatable if she has any great amount of determination, but as a lightener, she seems like a viable candidate for being able to create dark fountains. In terms of motive, I really have no idea. If someone like Bratty ended up being the knight, I feel like they'd have to be a puppet that was being tricked and manipulated, as otherwise I can't really see her having any reason or capability to bring about the roaring. Also, if the Spade King respecting Berdly seemed like a dubious concept, then him respecting Bratty seems even more absurd. I don't know why she would choose the school and the library as places to create dark fountains. Maybe she hates kids, or maybe she hates education. Given her Valley Girl persona, I wouldn't put it past her to be stupid and petty enough to do something like that, although that's hardly a strong argument for her being the knight. As for opportunity, Bratty doesn't seem to attend school, so I'm not sure if there's any obvious opportunity for her to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. She could feasibly create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain as it is inside a public library, although we never see her anywhere near that library, so even that option seems dubious. You'd expect her to create a dark fountain in her alleyway before creating it in random places like the library or school. In short, Bratty is not particularly knight-like, she has no clear motivation for pursuing such an endeavor, and perhaps more importantly, she is a joke side character who Toby Fox would almost certainly never make the antagonist of any game in a million years. It's not 100% impossible, so I'll still put her in D tier, but please understand, she is light years less likely to be the knight than the other D tier candidates. Next up is the most uncomfortably relatable character in fiction, Burgerpants, aka Pizzapants. As for means, he only seems to have 3 fingers. He has nothing to do with knights, he is never seen with a weapon, and I can't imagine that he has a great deal of determination. That said, he does have long arms, and it's possible that his Ice-E mascot suit could become a suit of armor in the Dark World and would help conceal his identity. In terms of motive, very few characters have a life as consistently terrible as Burgerpants, so I would not put it past him to want to bring about the roaring in order to shake things up. Hilariously enough, one of his most iconic lines is that he can't go to hell because he's out of vacation days, which is a line Spampton references, and Jevil directly connects the concept of hell with the knight. Actually, now that I think about it, Spampton and Burgerpants have a weird amount in common. Their faces are strangely similar in the shop, they both work in sales, they're both intensely expressive and cynical, they both talk about hell and vacation days, they both are prominently shown using phones, and they both want to be big shots. Dang. I don't know if that proves anything about Burgerpants being the knight, but it definitely makes me wonder if Burgerpants has some greater purpose in this narrative. I mean, we never find out his real name, right? That seems like a joke at first, but what if Toby Fox is using that joke to cover up the fact that Burgerpants fills a greater role in this story? Again, don't know if this is relevant to the knight, but being tied to another ambitious and powerful character like Spamton could definitely be used as evidence that Burgerpants may also be ambitious enough to be the knight. As for opportunity, this is where we reach issues with this theory. Burgerpants has a day job and is not going to school, which means that he has very few opportunities to sneak off and create dark fountains. Of all the characters we've discussed thus far, Burgerpants has more ongoing responsibilities that keep him away from the rest of the town than anybody else, which definitely hurts the idea that he might be the knight. If he was working at his day job, he couldn't have been creating the cyberworld. Overall, Burgerpants definitely has the motive and the disposition to bring about the roaring, and I'm beginning to think there's more to him than meets the eye, but his minimal number of fingers, his lack of weapons and armor, and his lack of opportunity to create these dark fountains makes him a rather unlikely candidate for being the knight. I'll go ahead and put him in C tier. Next is the first Darkner on our list, Cap'n. Cap'n is the only member of the Sweet Cap'n Cakes to have 5 fingers. He is made of metal, so that could potentially make him knight-like, and he seems to have decently long arms. However, he does not wield a knife, and he doesn't really seem competent enough to steal a human soul, which makes it seem rather unlikely that he would be capable of creating a dark fountain. It's also unclear why he would bother creating a dark fountain in the empty classroom at the school. Considering Sham doesn't recognize him, and Cap'n doesn't seem to recognize Sham or Rule's card, it seems unlikely that Cap'n has ever been to the Card Kingdom. In terms of motive, Cap'n is a rebel, but he's only become a rebel recently. For the most part, he's just a musician, and seeing as he's part of a trio, it seems like he has a fairly sweet life, so it's hard to see why or how he'd go about becoming the knight. He also, at one point, literally says, "What does that knight have that I don't?" Which could be a cover-up line on his part, but I honestly have my doubts that Cap'n is smart enough to conceal such an elaborate ruse. As for opportunity, Cap'n certainly could have created the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, but him creating the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain seems dubious at best, especially considering he's part of a band. If he's part of a band, wouldn't his friends notice if he left to go create a dark world and overthrow the Card Kingdom monarchy? Seems like there's too many eyes on him for that to entirely make sense. Overall, while Cap'n matches one or two of the physical details of the knight, him being a rather unassuming Darkner with no clear connections to any existing Lightners makes it feel rather unlikely that he is secretly the Roaring Knight. Plus, if he really was the Roaring Knight, then why would he help Kris defeat the Queen in the final battle? The Queen was trying to create more Dark Fountains, so helping the Delta Warriors seems irrational if he really was the Knight. Also, he's clearly an inconsequential comedic side character, so I sincerely doubt he holds any greater meaning in this story. As such, I think Cap'n is a solid D tier. And since it's not really worth my time to discuss all 3 of these characters separately, I'll go ahead and put Sweet and KK right there next to him, as none of them really make sense to be the knight. Next up is the younger sister of Catti, Catti. Catti's hands are never seen in clear detail, but her older sister has 4 digits on each paw, so Catti is probably the same, which is enough to match the knight. Her arms are arguably long, and she certainly seems determined enough to create dark fountains if push came to shove. That said, she has nothing to do with armor or weapons or knives, and technically she has paws, not hands. In terms of motive, Catti is a practitioner of the occult who blatantly dislikes how cheerful and enthusiastic her family is, as she literally says that she wishes they were more goth. So, to be certain, she definitely seems to have the right disposition to want to bring about an era of darkness. And perhaps most importantly, her research into the occult gives a viable way for her to have discovered the existence of dark worlds and how to create them. This is actually pretty rare, as most of the other candidates, even if they have the right disposition, don't have a clear route for discovering the existence of the Roaring or the Dark Fountains in the first place. So Catti definitely has the edge in that regard. That said, beyond her goth nature, I do find it dubious that she would actually end up wanting the roaring to happen, especially since it feels like she's probably going to have an adventure with Kris, much like Berdly and Noelle in one of the future chapters. Although that is admittedly just speculation on my part. In terms of opportunity, she is a student at the school and thus has the opportunity to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. However, much like Burgerpants, Catti has a job that she works in the afternoon, so it's possible that she has too strong of an alibi to successfully create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. Overall, Catti is an occult practitioner with the right hobbies and interests to conceivably be the Roaring Knight, and she matches a couple of the Knight's attributes. But she has nothing to do with armor or weapons, and her afternoon job puts her in the wrong place to actually be in position to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. As such, I'd say she's a solid B tier. Next up is Catti's older sister, Catti. Catti has all the same problems as Bratty, but is arguably even more unlikely to be the knight. She has paws instead of hands, she has nothing to do with knights or armor or weapons, and it's debatable if she has any meaningful amount of determination. She might have somewhat long arms and the correct number of fingers, but that's the only aspect of her appearance that even remotely matches the knight. In terms of motive, much like Bratty, I really have no idea. It really doesn't make sense, as Catti is arguably even more happy with her lot in life than Bratty was, and thus it seems unlikely that she would want to bring about an era of darkness, and that's assuming she even has the ability to bring something like that about, which is highly dubious, as she's not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed. And unlike Bratty, Catti actually has a family member attending the school, so her creating a dangerous dark world in the school makes even less sense. As for opportunity, she could theoretically sneak her way into the school or the library, but again, it is highly debatable if Catti is competent enough to pull off such a scheme. There's no proof that she couldn't have made these dark fountains, but the entire concept does feel out of character for her. The only tiny detail that might hint at Catti being responsible for creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is the fact that she has a room in the Queen's mansion. This implies that she has, in fact, visited the library before, and thus could have been at the scene of the crime. But that's literally the only suspicious detail about her entire character, so that hardly amounts to much. Overall, Catti is just like her former best friend, Bratty, as she is not very knight-like, has no clear motivation for wanting to bring the roaring about, and she is a joke character that Toby Fox would never make the primary antagonist in a million years. Honestly, I think it makes even less sense for Catti to be the knight than Bratty, so I'm putting her at the very bottom of D tier. Next is the original adopted child of the Dreamer family, Chara. This one is rather interesting, as it is assuming that there is a Chara in the Deltarune timeline, which might not be the case. Chara may not exist, or they might be dead, or they might literally be Kris. Furthermore, there are two versions of Chara that we need to discuss. The original human version of Chara and the undead abomination version of Chara that is created at the end of the genocide route. These two versions of the character are different enough to warrant separate discussions, much like Asriel and Flowey. So first, I will discuss how likely it is that the original human version of Chara could end up being the Roaring Knight. Starting with means, the original version of Chara in the Undertale timeline matches several of the elements that define the physical appearance of the knight. Chara had 5 fingers, wielded a knife, and as a human, almost certainly wielded a respectable quantity of determination, and thus could likely create dark fountains. Furthermore, if they're anything like Kris, then they would likely automatically acquire armor upon entering the Dark World. Chara was, admittedly, a small child, so their arms are rather short, but if this is an older version of Chara we are dealing with, then their arms could have easily grown longer. In terms of motive, Chara was both unhappy and unhinged. They climbed Mount Ebott potentially to commit suicide as a direct result of their hatred for humanity. After falling into the underground, they decided to devote themselves to saving the monsters and literally poisoned themselves in order to fuse with Asriel and get the opportunity to kill some of the humans that they hated. You could argue that Chara had good intentions in this story. It's admittedly a matter of interpretation, but what this tells us is that Chara is a dangerous and intense person who is willing to pursue radical and deadly strategies in order to bring about their desired goals. As such, if Chara thought the roaring or the angel's heaven was something worth pursuing, they would be more than willing to become the roaring knight. Obviously, they would have to have a different story in Deltarune, but assuming their core personality is the same, then they've clearly got the aptitude to bring about the roaring. Honestly, having Chara be the main antagonist would definitely be an interesting turn of events. In terms of opportunity, this is where this option gets extremely dubious. Kris is, as far as we know, the only human in the hometown. As such, if a new human, presumably an adult human, came to town, that would be extremely notable, and tons of people would be talking about it. As such, in order for this to work, Chara would have to completely conceal their presence in the hometown, and while that's not impossible, it has much less evidence supporting it than most of the other options. Furthermore, if this game takes place around the same era as Undertale, then Chara could be long dead, which would make this option much harder to swing. That said, we don't know for certain whose red soul this is during the opening intro sequence. As such, if this is actually Chara's soul, and Gaster did something with it, like put it in a new, younger vessel, then it could be that Chara is alive and well, and has become the Roaring Knight. But again, this is assuming that Kris isn't the Deltarune version of Chara, which we don't actually know to be the case. As far as human Chara is concerned, they are definitely a strong contender, as they have determination in spades, 5 fingers, they should have longer arms, they're known to wield a knife, and if they're similar to Kris, then they likely acquired a suit of armor upon entering the Dark World. They also have the perfect attitude and disposition to want to bring about the roaring, and while it's a somewhat hard sell to believe they're sneaking around undetected in the hometown, the fact that they may be the character featured in this intro sequence with Gaster definitely lends itself to Chara being the twist villain of this story. As such, I would say human Chara is the first A-tier option on this list. There are some holes in this theory, so it's not guaranteed, but they are an important enough character for this to be a highly compelling option. Next, we have to talk about the resurrected nightmare version of Chara, who I will just call the Demon. To be clear, the Demon is not Chara, in the same way that Flowey is not Asriel. The Demon is a soulless abomination, while Chara was a human with at least some good in them. In terms of means, the Demon has many of the same attributes that made Chara a viable option. They have 5 fingers, they wield a knife, they have the determination of the soul that they purchased from the player, and there's a good chance that they would be outfitted with armor upon entering the Dark World. The only attribute that the Demon lacks is the long arms. However, as an unnatural abomination, it's quite possible that this creature could extend its arms or possess someone who actually has long arms, so there's definitely ways to work around this shortcoming. In terms of motive, this is where things get complicated. According to the Demon itself, it exists purely to acquire power. That is its purpose. It exists to destroy its enemies and increase its stats. That is all it cares about. It cannot understand why the player insists on recreating the Undertale world, but it also doesn't care. It will come whenever and wherever its name is called, destroy the enemy, and gain power. So, while it is definitely unethical enough to bring about the end of the world, the issue is with the choice to become the Roaring Knight. Why would an entity free of any desire except the urge to destroy bother with such an elaborate ruse? Maybe it wants to lure out the angel in order to kill a truly powerful foe, but still, that demonstrates a level of complexity that the demon, by its own admittance, does not seem to possess. Maybe it could grow and evolve over time, much like Flowey, but that's making some very broad assumptions that are not backed up by the evidence. Furthermore, as an entity from another world, the demon would have to be summoned to this Deltarune reality in order to appear. So who could possibly have summoned it? Could it be Gaster? If so, why would he bother summoning an entity of pure destruction? Even he doesn't seem that insane. While I could imagine the demon making a cameo if you pursue some sort of genocide route in Deltarune, I can't really see them bothering with all this Roaring Knight stuff. That just doesn't seem in character for an entity as simple and straightforward as the demon. In terms of opportunity, the demon wields enough power to completely reconstruct entire realities. So if it really has been summoned to this world, and it really is the Roaring Knight, then it wields more than enough power to teleport from place to place and create dark fountains. Although, honestly, if the demon was the Roaring Knight, then you'd think it wouldn't take so long to bring about the roaring. Couldn't an entity like the demon be capable of creating dozens of dark fountains per day? Why is it taking so long? Even if it was doing this for some end goal, I can't imagine such a laser-focused entity as the demon would waste time when it could be killing people and acquiring more power. And of course, the demon only appears if you call its name, which means it's literally impossible for it to be the Roaring Knight if nobody knows it exists, which they might not. As such, while the demon definitely has the power to bring about the roaring, the specific circumstances necessary for it to be brought here and then to be convinced that this plan is worth its time makes this option extremely convoluted and dubious. Overall, the demon has the right attributes and powers to be the Roaring Knight, and it's certainly unethical enough to bring about the end of the world, but this intricate plan to bring about the roaring seems far too complex for an entity like the demon to bother with. In the time it takes for the roaring to be brought about, the demon could have destroyed this world several times over. As such, while I know the demon being involved in this game is a fairly popular theory, I think people are kind of forgetting how utterly simplistic and direct this entity is. It's not like Flowey, and it's not like Chara. It has a one-track mind focused on a very simple goal: kill everything and gain power. So, while definitely one of the more interesting candidates to discuss, I find the likelihood of the demon being the Roaring Knight rather low, and thus I would put it in C tier. Next up is Chilldrake. As far as means, Chilldrake is rather short, has no arms or fingers, and is thus incapable of wielding a knife. They do seem strong-willed enough to potentially create dark fountains, and while they don't exactly look like a knight, Berdly qualified as a knight in the Dark World, so maybe Chilldrake would too. In terms of motive, Chilldrake's entire personality revolves around bringing about anarchy, and thus they have the perfect mindset to want to bring about the roaring. That said, in Undertale, they cared a great deal about Snowy, and if this is still true in Deltarune, then it seems unlikely that Chilldrake would risk Snowy's life by creating a dark fountain in the school where Snowy attends. In terms of opportunity, Chilldrake hasn't even appeared in Deltarune yet, so either they don't exist, or they have very effectively avoided encountering Kris during the day. As such, whether they had the opportunity to bring about the Dark Fountains is unclear. That said, if the knight really is one of the Lighteners in the hometown, I find it unlikely that Toby Fox would conceal that Lightener for several chapters. Although, again, that's just speculation on my part. Overall, Chilldrake completely fails to match the knight's appearance, and may not even exist in the Deltarune reality. As such, while they do have the right mindset to bring about the roaring, their insignificance in the plot and their lack of arms, hands, or knives makes me think this option is pretty much impossible. As such, Chilldrake is the first F tier in this video. Next is Clover. As far as means go, Clover has rather long arms, but that's the only detail that seems to match the knight. They have paws rather than hands, they only have 3 fingers on those paws, they don't wield a knife or wear armor, and as a darkener they would need to have stolen a lightener's soul or their determination in order to create dark fountains, which I find extremely unlikely for someone as flighty as Clover to have pulled off. In terms of motive, Clover literally has multiple personalities, so it's entirely possible that one of them has the correct mindset to want to bring about the roaring. They do attempt to stop the Delta warriors, so they are at least helping with the king's plan to cover the world in darkness, which makes them more feasible in terms of personality than Cap'n was. In terms of opportunity, this is where things get dubious. Clover could have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, but given how they have been trapped in this empty classroom for ages, it seems unlikely that they could have stolen a Lightner's soul during that time. It makes even less sense for them to have created the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, as we meet Clover in the castle town prior to heading off to the Cyberworld, which means it's borderline impossible for them to have beat Kris and Susie to the library. Overall, Clover is another extremely unlikely option. They don't match the knight's description almost at all, and it seems borderline impossible for them to have created the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. As such, even though they might have the right motivation, I would say Clover being the knight is less believable than even Cap'n was, and thus they end up in F tier. Next up is Crystal, aka Snowdrake's mother. In terms of means, much like Chilldrake, Crystal doesn't have fingers, arms, or any noticeable connection to knives or armor or knights, and it's unknown if she possessed any notable quantity of determination. In terms of motive, Crystal is not well fleshed out, but she seems to have been a proud mother who cared for her family, and she may have also been a comedian. However, it's rather hard to tell if she would have possessed any reason to bring about the roaring, as she's a barely comprehensible amalgamate in Undertale, and she's dead in Deltarune. Since her son goes to the school, I find it unlikely that she would risk his life by opening a dark fountain there. In terms of opportunity, Crystal is literally dead, so that's a fairly strong alibi implying that she is not the knight. It's possible that her soul was stolen by a darkener, but as far as Crystal herself goes, it seems extremely unlikely that she could have faked her own death and began creating dark fountains. Overall, Crystal makes even less sense to be the Roaring Knight than Chilldrake, and I'm somewhat wondering if it was even worth bringing her up in the first place. She doesn't match the knight's appearance, doesn't have any clear motive to bring about the roaring, and she has a fairly strong alibi due to her being dead. As such, I'll be putting Crystal right at the bottom of F tier. Next is the father of Catti and Catti, Dad Cat. In terms of means, he presumably has paws instead of hands and is never seen with weapons or armor of any sort. That said, he is an adult, so his arm is somewhat long, and the fact that he has lost one of his arms could imply that Dad Cat was a soldier at some point, which means he could have some experience with weapons and he might have above average determination. He is also a large man, so much like Asgore, this line mentioning a large person could be hinting at the size of the knight. He also probably has 4 fingers, which is the minimum necessary to match the knight. In terms of motive, we don't know much about Dad Cat, and considering he had to get his stomach pumped for oranges, he's scared of pickles, and the fact that he doesn't know Asriel's real name, it seems like he might be about as stupid as his eldest daughter, which makes it somewhat hard to believe that he could bring about the roaring. He also seems like a fairly happy man, so it seems unlikely that he'd want to shake up the status quo. Plus, his daughter goes to the school, so you'd think Dad Cat wouldn't want to put his daughter at risk by making a dark fountain there. And in terms of opportunity, his daughter goes to the school, so it's conceivable that he could have snuck in and created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, and it is theoretically possible that he could have gone to the library, although we have no evidence supporting that. Overall, Dad Cat might have a secret or two, especially with his missing arm, but he has no clear motivation for bringing about the roaring, and while he might have had the opportunity to make these dark fountains, it seems against his character to put his daughter at risk by making them. That said, he does have enough mystery around him to make slightly more sense than Catti, so I'll put him in C tier. Side note, I won't be ranking Mom Cat, as there's even less to discuss with her than Dad Cat. Honestly, I only included him because he's missing an arm, and that caught my attention. Next up is Des Holiday. In terms of means, we don't know how long Des's arms are, and we don't actually know how many fingers the Holiday family possess, but they definitely seem to have fingers and decently long arms. Des doesn't seem to have any known connection to knights or armor or knives, but she did attack Kris with a wiffle bat at one point, so she has wielded a weapon before. She's also a lightener, and she sounds like she's stronger-willed than Noelle, so it seems feasible that she could create dark fountains. In terms of motive, this is where things get extremely speculative. We don't know much about Des's personality beyond her being protective of Noelle, so that's all we really have to go off of. That said, her and Noelle made a doll of the angel in their youth group at church, so it may be that Des was on the religious side. As such, it could be that she wants to bring about the angel's heaven in order to make a better world for her sister, and that's why she became the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, the implication seems to be that Des is either dead or missing, which either increases her chances of being the knight or decreases it, depending on which interpretation is correct. If she's dead, then it would be rather difficult for her to be the Roaring Knight. However, she has no gravestone in the graveyard, so it stands to reason that she's probably just missing. Maybe she ran away from home or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Des having an unhappy home life could definitely be a reason for her wanting to bring about the roaring. Alternatively, if she was abducted or something similar, then that means there's likely a greater mystery to be uncovered regarding Des, which could be evidence that she has become the Roaring Knight against her will. If she is the knight, she would need to conceal her identity when sneaking into the library or into the school, so that part is somewhat dubious. But Des, being the knight, would explain why the queen was so fixated on Noelle. If the queen saw the knight and they looked like an older sibling of Noelle's, then it would make perfect sense for the queen to try and create a new knight using another member of the Holiday family. Overall, Des is such a mysterious character that it's hard to discuss her role in this game. That said, she seems to match a couple of the knight's attributes. There's a major mystery surrounding her that could tie into her being the knight, and she may have just the right combination of trauma, personality traits, and determination to bring about the roaring. She definitely seems to play some major role in this story, so why couldn't that role be that of the main antagonist? That said, her lack of connection to knights and armor and weapons definitely hurts this option, and the fact that she might simply be dead also hurts her candidacy. As such, I'm going to go ahead and put Des in B tier. I think she is one of the more compelling candidates, but there's just too much mystery surrounding her for me to feel confident putting her in A tier. Next is Dogamy, Doggeressa, Doggo, Lesser Dog, and Greater Dog, also known as the Wet-Nosed Bandits, who I will be analyzing together. In terms of means, they have paws instead of hands, but they all have decently long arms, 4 fingers on each paw, and in the Undertale timeline, they were members of the Royal Guard and wielded weapons, including knives, and several of them wore the armor of a knight. There's quite a few of them, so it stands to reason that some of them are strong-willed enough to create dark fountains. Several of them are also fairly large, and thus could be the ones being referenced by this large person line. In terms of motive, the dogs are all criminals in this timeline, and there's at least one ending in Undertale where the dogs take over, so maybe they have the ambition to want to shake up the status quo by becoming the Roaring Knight. That said, all the dogs aren't exactly super intelligent, so it's a bit dubious that they have the competency to pull this off. They were all scared away from sneaking into Noelle's house by some unknown attacker, so I doubt they have the strength of will to bring about the apocalypse if they can't even handle a simple burglary. In terms of opportunity, this is where this option really falls apart. A gang of criminals sneaking into a school is already an extremely dubious prospect, but more importantly, the dogs were all locked up in jail, in the doghouse, if you will, with the implication seeming to be that they've been there for some time, which means it's extremely unlikely that they could have been in the right place at the right time to create any of the dark fountains. Overall, the dogs match some of the knight's description, but not enough to be convincing, and while they may have the right attitude for it, their lack of intelligence makes the idea of any of them successfully becoming the Roaring Knight a comical concept. Throw in the fact that they've been in jail for months, and I think it's safe to say that none of these characters could be the Roaring Knight. I put the dogs in D tier. I was going to talk about Endogeny next, but it occurs to me that this character doesn't even exist in Deltarune. There is the grave of Muttler, the former leader of the dogs, who was likely one of the monsters who made up Endogeny. However, Muttler would have all the issues that the other dogs have, on top of the fact that he is dead. As such, I'll just save us some time and put Endogeny/Muttler in F tier, as it's literally impossible for this entity to be the Roaring Knight. Next up is a much stranger candidate, Everyman. Everyman is a strange, recurring character that has never appeared in person, but who makes cameos in several places within both Undertale and Deltarune. In terms of means, Everyman has somewhat long arms, but he has no hands, fingers, armor, weapons, and he has nothing to do with knights. He may have some notable amount of determination, but he also might not. It's impossible to say. He might not even be a real person in the Deltarune reality, and may instead be a fictional character of some sort. In terms of motive, this is where things get borderline impossible to discuss. The only description we have of Everyman comes from the Undertale art book, in which Toby Fox describes him as a good guy who shows up on occasion. The showing up on occasion part could be a decent description of the knight, but it's debatable if the knight really qualifies as a good guy. That said, given Toby Fox's writing style, I'm sure that whoever the knight turns out to be, they'll think of themselves as the good guy, so maybe this description could describe the knight. But honestly, this category is a dud. We really have no clue what motivates Everyman, or even if he's a real person. In terms of opportunity, this is also completely speculative. Given his ability to randomly appear in unexpected places, it's not impossible to imagine him showing up in the school or the library in order to create the Dark Fountains. That said, if he's a famous enough character to have people making graffiti of him, you'd think there'd be more discussion in the hometown from the people who saw the iconic Everyman walking around. Overall, Everyman is one of the most pervasive mysteries in this franchise. He could just be a meaningless inside joke that Toby Fox likes to slip into his games. Or he may be of profound importance to the plot. We really don't know. That said, I have extreme doubts that Toby Fox would make this random, bizarre entity, who was introduced as an attack by an amalgamate in Undertale, be the Roaring Knight in Deltarune. He doesn't match the knight's description regardless, so I think I'll just throw Everyman down in D tier and move on with the list. Next is one of the more popular and interesting candidates, Father Alvin. In terms of means, Alvin has relatively long arms, his father was a blacksmith and thus he might have access to weapons and armor, and he seems like the kind of man who might have a decent quantity of determination. Even if Alvin doesn't have access to armor, the fact that he's a turtle could cause him to naturally acquire armor upon entering the Dark World. Unfortunately, we can't quite make out how many fingers he has, but Gerson seemed to have 4 fingers in Undertale, which could very well be how many the knight has. As such, Father Alvin matches the knight's description to a T. In terms of motive, this is where Father Alvin has a very strong argument. He is a priest who worships the angel, and thus he would have substantial religious motivation to bring about the angel's heaven. In fact, his theological studies may have been responsible for him discovering the existence of the Dark World in the first place. Given the death of his father and this suspicious dialogue we get in Chapter 2, it definitely seems like Father Alvin has some secrets he's hiding, which could contribute to his motivation to bring about the Roaring as the Knight. And as an interesting side note, in medieval societies, knights were often born into nobility, and thus were often the sons of lords. And Gerson has written a book series called Lord of the Hammer. As such, you could argue that Father Alvin is the son of a lord, and is thus eligible to be a knight. In terms of opportunity, this option actually has quite a bit of interesting evidence. In the empty classroom where the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain was created, there is a drawing of Gerson on the wall, which has been confirmed to be a drawing that Father Alvin created. As such, this shows not only that Father Alvin attended this school, but also that he specifically knows about this particular classroom. As such, he may have chosen to create a dark fountain in this classroom specifically because he knows it was unused and abandoned. He likely doesn't want to hurt the kids, but if he knew that the classroom was abandoned, then he'd have no reason to worry about any children falling in. As for the cyberworld, this option is a little more dubious, as we never see Alvin anywhere near the library, but he is a priest after all, so it stands to reason that he would visit a place filled with books in order to further his theological studies. Although why he would create a dark fountain when there were children inside the computer lab is a hard question to answer. Maybe he doesn't care as much about the safety of children as you would expect, or maybe he thinks they'll be a necessary sacrifice for bringing about the angel's heaven. Or maybe he thinks the angel could revive them even if they did die. It's hard to say. Regardless, there's no evidence that Father Alvin has been to the library, but there's no evidence that he hasn't been either. Overall, Father Alvin is a very valid candidate, and the fact that he's a brand new character further increases the believability that he may secretly be the knight. He has the perfect motivation, plenty of opportunities to create fountains, and the right background to have conceivably discovered the existence of said fountains. Even his history with his father being a smith gives credence to the idea of him having access to armor and weapons. The Dark World has the Deltarune all over it, and Alvin literally wears the Deltarune on his robes, so the idea that he may be involved in this plot seems extremely believable. He also matches every single detail about the knight that we currently possess, which makes him an increasingly more compelling option. That said, there are one or two tiny details that could push against Alvin being the knight. For one, Father Alvin does not have a dialogue portrait that we see in conversation, which is something most other main characters have. Even Jockington has a dialogue portrait. Furthermore, Father Alvin has no dialogue sound clip that you hear when talking to him. Most other characters have a distinct audio clip that represents their voice when they're talking, including characters like Noelle and Berdly, and yet Father Alvin does not. When he talks, it uses the same generic audio clip that all the minor NPCs are given. Of course, this could be Toby Fox just pulling a sly one and pretending Father Alvin is not important. And of course, even with those minor issues, he still has hordes of evidence in his favor. As such, since Father Alvin is easily one of the strongest contenders for being the knight, I will happily put him in A tier. Next up is the final boss of most Undertale timelines, Flowey. In terms of means, Flowey is a flower, and is thus incapable of wielding knives or armor, and he literally does not have arms or hands. His Omega form could create hands for him to use, but that form only existed for a brief period of time, and is officially defeated in all Undertale timelines, so I highly doubt it could appear in Deltarune. The only attribute that Flowey meets the requirements of is the fact that he did, in fact, wield a great deal of determination, and while it doesn't make sense for Flowey to be mistaken as a knight, it would explain why the Spade King respects him. Flowey would happily put a lunatic like the Spade King into power, and since Flowey isn't actually a Lightner, the king would have no reason to hate him. Next is motive. Honestly, given Flowey's track record, I would not put it past him to pursue the roaring just to see what would happen. He'd even create dark fountains in schools and risk the lives of children, as he is a sociopath with no respect for the sanctity of life. He may be doing this to gain power, he may be doing this to accomplish some other goal, but it's definitely conceivable that Flowey would walk this path. Plus, hey, Flowey was the primary antagonist in Undertale, so why not have him be the primary antagonist in Deltarune too? Next is Opportunity, and that's where this option completely falls apart. Flowey shouldn't exist in the Deltarune reality, which means that in order for him to be the knight, he would have to find some way to travel from the Undertale timeline to the Deltarune one, and as far as we know, that is not possible. Sure, Sans was at one point able to hop between worlds, but that required a machine that is now broken. So without that machine, I can't see Flowey managing to hop from one reality to another. If he did manage to get to Deltarune, then him sneaking into the school or library would be child's play given his ability to burrow underground, but without the ability to somehow travel between worlds, this option seems impossible. Overall, Flowey has the perfect motive and personality to be the Roaring Knight, but he lacks most of the attributes that define the Knight, and it's borderline impossible for Flowey to reach the Deltarune reality in the first place. It could conceivably be possible for Flowey to accidentally get recreated in this timeline, but the circumstances that created Flowey are so specific and are so improbable to occur again that I don't think Flowey himself could ever actually appear in Deltarune. Maybe someone similar to Flowey could appear, but not Flowey himself. As such, I think I'll have to put Flowey in F tier, as it seems legitimately impossible for him to be the Roaring Knight. Next up is an option that is rather interesting to consider: Frisk. We covered the antagonist of Undertale, and now we're covering the protagonist. Funny how that works out. In terms of means, Frisk meets every requirement. They have 5 fingers, can wield a knife, would likely manifest armor if they entered the Dark World just like Kris, and they have more natural determination than any other character in this franchise. Their arms are rather short, but if we're dealing with an older version of Frisk, then they would match the knight's appearance perfectly. In terms of motive, this is where things get sketchy. It's hard exactly to tell what kind of person Frisk is, as they're being controlled by the player for the majority of Undertale. However, if you've seen my video on Who is Kris, then you'll know that I personally believe the evidence shows that Frisk is a good kid who just wants to avoid conflict and make friends. As such, it doesn't really make sense for Frisk to do things like create dark fountains and risk bringing about the end of the world. They're far too good of a person for something like that. It would take some very convoluted reasoning for Frisk to walk the path of the Roaring Knight, so in terms of motive, I think this option falls flat. In terms of opportunity, this is where things get complicated. Much like Flowey, I don't think it's possible for the Undertale version of Frisk to wind up in this reality. However, unlike Flowey, there should be a Deltarune version of Frisk somewhere in this world. In fact, Kris might literally be the Deltarune version of Frisk. However, if Frisk is not Kris, then that raises many of the same issues that Chara raised. Kris is the only known human in town, so some new human showing up and sneaking around would almost certainly raise suspicion and have people talking about it. Furthermore, if Deltarune takes place earlier on in the timeline, then Frisk may not have even been born yet. It's not impossible for Frisk to be sneaking about creating fountains, but it is highly unlikely. Overall, Frisk matches the knight in terms of most attributes, but they are far too kind to walk a path so reckless and harmful, and they also probably don't even exist in this reality at this point in time unless they are literally Kris. As such, while technically an option, I find Frisk being the Roaring Knight to make too little sense to be feasible, and thus I'd put Frisk in C tier. While I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and put the other human souls in C tier as well. They have most of the same problems and advantages as Frisk, but are much less significant characters. I will give a special shout out to the light blue soul, as their characteristics match the knight slightly more than the rest, but overall I think these characters are too minor to really factor into this discussion. Even if one of them is the knight, we know far too little about them to discuss this option any further. Next is one of my favorite characters, Gerson Boom. In terms of means, as we said with Father Alvin, Gerson was a smith who likely had access to armor and weapons. In Undertale, he was a legendary hero, so him being a knight would definitely be in character. He also has fairly long arms, natural armor in the form of his shell, the required number of fingers to potentially match the knight, and as the toughest monster to ever live, he definitely seems like the sort to have above average determination. The only detail he fails to match is the fact that his chosen weapon was a hammer and not a knife. In terms of motive, Gerson was the father of Father Alvin, who went on to be a priest of the Angel. As such, it's quite possible that Gerson is also the religious type. But even without that religious angle, he's a historian who was well read, and thus he could have done the research necessary to have discovered the existence of dark fountains. Heck, in Undertale, he is literally studying the Deltarune, and is the only character to ever bring it up, so you'd expect him to play some larger role in Deltarune the game. He was also a fairly morally gray character, as even though he was lauded as a great hero, he never saw himself as one. He just did what he had to in order to protect his people. As such, with that degree of moral nuance, it is possible that Gerson might be convinced to pursue the Roaring. However, that's where this logic seems to have issues. The Roaring is supposed to bring devastation, and Gerson is specifically known for being a teacher who cared for his kids, so him choosing to create dark fountains in the school and the library seems out of character for Gerson. Similarly, given how fond he was of Asgore in Undertale, I find it extremely unlikely that Gerson would feel comfortable putting a despot like the Spade King into power. In terms of opportunity, Gerson is apparently dead, which is a pretty strong alibi in favor of him not being the knight. That said, if he was somehow alive, him being a former teacher and a historian would suggest that he had likely visited both the unused classroom that later became the Card Kingdom and the library that later would house the Cyberworld. That said, the whole being dead hurdle is pretty massive, and Gerson was already a super old man, so him being the main antagonist feels dubious. It would feel strange for us to beat up some old turtle if he turned out to be the knight. That said, I do think it's interesting that Gerson was known as the Hammer of Justice in Undertale, and the Spade King has a line where he says he wields the Chain of Justice. This is reminiscent of Undyne, who is also inspired by Gerson, who wields the Spear of Justice. Furthermore, Gerson wrote a book series called Lord of the Hammer, and in medieval societies, while lords tended to employ knights, lords would also fight in battle alongside their knights, and thus Gerson, as Lord of the Hammer, could have some inherent ties to knighthood. This could all be coincidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. Overall, Gerson matches every known attribute of the knight, arguably has a somewhat decent motivation to bring about the Roaring, has the right background to have discovered the existence of the Dark Fountains, and could definitely have known about the empty classroom and computer lab due to his time as a teacher and historian. However, his care for his children and students, his extreme age, and the fact that he is supposedly dead all come together to make this option problematic. Gerson being the knight has enough issues that I can't put him in A tier, but I feel like he has enough connections to knighthood, enough similarities with the knight, and enough background with the Deltarune that he's better than most of the C tiers. As such, I'll put him in B tier. Next is the Mad Jester Jevil. In terms of means, Jevil doesn't match almost any of the knight's traits. He's shorter than Kris, and thus has shorter arms. He's a jester and not a knight. He doesn't wear armor, his sprite does not reveal how many fingers he has, and he wields a scythe instead of a knife. That said, he does seem more powerful than the other Darkners, which could imply that he has determination. And while he doesn't wield a knife, his weapon does have the word knife in its name. Furthermore, his weapon is literally called the Devil's Knife, and since the knight has been connected to hell, Jevil transforming into a weapon with the word devil in it could be hinting he's the knight. In terms of motive, Jevil has been driven mad and views the whole world as a game, and thus he is more than capable of bringing about the roaring if he thought it would be fun. Since having fun is his only real motivation, and since he's so knowledgeable about the knight, it could be argued that he has this knowledge as a direct result of being the knight, and he's just doing all the roaring stuff for fun. That said, if he really is the knight, then it wouldn't really make sense for him to give the Delta Warriors his armor/weapon to help them in their quest, as they are actively fighting against his plans. Then again, he is insane, so maybe he's easily distracted from his goals. In terms of opportunity, this is where this option goes straight into the trash can. Jevil has been imprisoned for quite some time, and since it was the Four Kings who imprisoned Jevil, that means Jevil was locked up long before the knight came to town. Furthermore, if the Delta Warriors don't fight him in Chapter 1, he stays imprisoned, which would make him creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain borderline impossible. Furthermore, when he is defeated, he talks about the knight, and it doesn't really make sense to do that if he is the knight. Maybe he's trying to confuse the heroes, but it doesn't really make sense for the first secret boss in Deltarune to also be the primary antagonist. Also, Jevil says he's going to sleep for the next 100 years, and he turned himself into his weapon and gives himself to the heroes to use. If he's asleep and literally in our inventory, then it seems impossible for him to be sneaking off and creating dark fountains. As it stands, unless there's some crazy plot twists, Jevil is one of the only characters whose whereabouts are constantly verified. He was imprisoned before the Delta Warriors arrived, and he was asleep in their inventory for the rest of the time. As such, as far as opportunity goes, Jevil seems incapable of being in the right places at the right times to be the Roaring Knight. Overall, while Jevil's personality could certainly allow him to pursue the roaring, Jevil fails to match most of the knight's attributes, on top of it being seemingly impossible for him to have created any of the dark fountains we've seen thus far. In order to be the knight, he would have to have secretly acquired a Lightner's determination, have secretly broke out of prison, have disguised himself as the knight without ever being recognized by any of the Card Kingdom Darkners, have snuck back into his prison to fight us, to have snuck out of our inventory to go create the cyberworld, and then snuck back into our inventory without us ever noticing. I'm not saying that Jevil being the knight is completely and utterly impossible, but it certainly feels completely and utterly impossible. As such, Jevil goes right down into F tier. Next up is the kindest, coolest, and all-around greatest person in Deltarune. You know him, you love him, Jockington. In terms of means, Jockington, as a cool green snake, has no arms, or legs, or fingers, and is thus incapable of wielding a weapon, or armor, or matching any of the details that define the knight's appearance. The only detail he has in his favor is the fact that he, as Jockington, likely has a great deal of determination. In terms of motive, Jockington is far too kind and honest and, simple-minded to ever want to bring about the roaring. It's possible that he could be tricked into pursuing that course. Maybe he learned about the roaring from Catti, but as far as his baseline personality is concerned, I cannot imagine that Jockington would risk the lives of his classmates by creating dark worlds in the library or school. It just seems too out of character for the great Jockington. In terms of opportunity, Jockington is a student at the school and is also known to use the library, so he'd have plenty of opportunities to create the Dark Worlds. That said, he is found at the diner with Catti at the end of Chapter 2, so if he was in the diner the whole day, it's possible that he has an alibi that keeps him from being the knight. Overall, Jockington is far too cool to be the Roaring Knight. He doesn't match the Knight's description, he doesn't have the right motive or personality to pursue the Roaring, and while he could have created the Dark Fountains, it is highly probable that he did no such thing. As such, I will put Jockington in the tier that is reserved for only the coolest of characters. Next is the first big antagonist in Deltarune, the King, also known as the Spade King. In terms of means, the king is a fairly large man who wields various strange weapons. He has 4 fingers, and as a king, you could argue that he is associated with knights, but none of his weapons appear to be knives, and he doesn't appear to wear armor. As a Darkener, he would need to steal a Lightner's determination to create dark fountains, and given his loss at the hands of the Delta warriors, it seems distinctly unlikely that the king has managed to defeat any Lightners in his time. In terms of motive, the king very plainly lays out his reasons for wanting to bring about an age of darkness. He wants to allow the Darkeners the chance to govern themselves and overthrow the cruel Lightners that abandoned them. Of course, if he is the knight, then we'd have to assume that he is pretending to be both the Spade King and the knight at the same time, which seems like a rather tall order, but it's not impossible. In terms of opportunity, the king has been locked up in the unused classroom for some time, and thus was in the right position to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. However, given that he is defeated and locked up at the end of Chapter 1, it seems impossible for him to have created the Cyberworld. Furthermore, given that the knight overthrew the other kings and put the Spade King in charge, this implies that there were people who saw the king and the knight at the same time, which seems like pretty substantial evidence that they are not the same person. Even Sham regards the two as different characters, and I'm inclined to trust Sham. Throw in the fact that it wouldn't really make sense for the king to be the knight and get defeated in the very first chapter, and this already dubious option becomes increasingly unlikely. Overall, the Spade King has the right mindset to be the knight, but he fails to match a number of the knight's attributes. He almost certainly lacks the ability to create dark fountains, he was in the wrong place to create the cyberworld, and multiple people seem to have seen the king and the knight at the same time, which seems to put the final nail in the coffin for this candidate. As such, I'm going to go ahead and put the Spade King in F tier. Next is the candidate that everyone, at least for a moment, thought was the knight. Kris. In terms of means, Kris meets almost all of the requirements. They wield a knife, they dress like a knight, they have 5 fingers, and they clearly have enough determination to create dark fountains, as they are literally the only character to create a dark fountain on screen thus far. However, there is one detail that Kris has that doesn't line up with the knight. Kris has rather short arms. This is specifically highlighted in Chapter 2, when Kris is unable to reach the controls. The game literally comments that your arms are too short, and this is the same chapter where the knight is revealed to have long hands/arms. This comes across as Toby Fox intentionally drawing attention to a specific difference between Kris and the knight. In terms of motive, the exact motivations that push Kris to be the knight are unknown, but we know they have the motivation to pursue the Roaring, as they willingly created a dark fountain at the end of Chapter 2, despite hearing what Rousey said about the risk. I have my own theories regarding why Kris is creating this dark fountain, which you can hear about in my Rousey video, but regardless of the specifics, we know that they must have some sort of motivation, as they are clearly making the choice to walk this path. In terms of opportunity, this is where Kris being the knight starts to fall apart. Kris could totally have been responsible for creating the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, but if they did, then why does the Spade King not recognize Kris? The knight literally put the king into power, so it really doesn't make sense for him to not recognize the knight. Similarly, the queen likely encountered the knight as well, and yet she doesn't recognize Kris either, despite having facial recognition systems. Sham doesn't say Kris is the knight, and neither does Jevil, which is extremely damning evidence considering Jevil clearly has forbidden knowledge. There's also the fact that Kris is never labeled as knight, despite knight being a class that exists, as shown by Susie. And Kris creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is legitimately impossible. As we discussed at the start of this video, Ralsei didn't detect the Dark Fountain until after Kris and Susie left the castle town. And since it doesn't make sense for Noelle and Berdly to just dive headfirst into a dark world, the only explanation is that the Dark Fountain was created extremely recently. And since we are viewing Kris's point of view throughout Chapter 2, there's literally no opportunity for Kris to sneak off and make the fountain. The ending scene of Chapter 1 could be interpreted to be Kris sneaking off to make the cyberworld, but based off what we see in Chapter 2, it seems like Kris can only be without their soul for short periods of time. So the amount of time needed to run all the way to the library, create the Dark Fountain, and run all the way back seems a bit too much to be believable. And that's not even addressing the fact that if Kris really did make the Dark World the night before, not only did Noelle and Berdly willingly jump into the cyberworld, but this interpretation also requires that literally nobody else noticed the supernatural portal to another world in the middle of their public library. Remember, Noelle and Berdly didn't go to the library until after school, which means that this theory holds that the Dark World was in place all day, and yet nobody noticed it until Noelle and Berdly showed up. Furthermore, if we take Queen's word literally, she says that the cyberworld was created today. Not last night, today. All this evidence together makes it seem extremely unlikely that Kris could have created this fountain. Overall, Kris matches most of the knight's attributes and has proven that they are willing to create dark fountains, but the evidence strongly suggests that Kris could not have been the one to create the Card Kingdom and Cyberworld dark fountains. Throw in the extremely suspicious detail about Kris having short arms and the fact that nobody recognizes them as the knight, and I think this option loses a lot of its credibility. I'll still go ahead and put Kris in B tier, as they do have more evidence in favor of them being the knight than most other characters, but the issues with this option keeps Kris out of A tier. Next is the first Darkner we ever encounter, Lancer. In terms of means, Lancer doesn't really match the knight very well. He has shorter arms than Kris, does not wield a knife or wear armor, and it seems distinctly unlikely that Lancer could have stolen the determination of a Lightner. That said, Lancer is the son of a king, which gives him the right to be a knight, and he does have 4 fingers. Furthermore, his name is literally Lancer, and Lancers are generally soldiers on horseback wielding lances, which could be argued to make Lancer a knight. In terms of motive, Lancer wanted to create dark fountains to please his dad at the start of Chapter 1, but ever since then he has changed his tune and is now assisting the Delta Warriors. As such, unless he has hidden depths, Lancer does not seem to care about creating dark fountains or anything like that, which makes it extremely dubious if he has the right attitude to be the knight. And if he really was the knight, why would he help the Delta Warriors defeat his own father? That doesn't make sense. In terms of opportunity, Lancer was locked up in the empty classroom for some time, but much like his father, the knight is responsible for putting Lancer into a position of power, and the idea of everyone in the kingdom, including Lancer's own dad, not realizing that Lancer is the knight seems absurd at best, and impossible at worst. Furthermore, Lancer is literally in our inventory at the time that the Cyberworld Dark Fountain is being created, which means he has a perfect alibi supporting the idea that he is not the knight. Overall, Lancer has a couple of niche details that could arguably support him being the knight, but the vast majority of his characterization, motivations, and personal timeline seem to be completely opposed to this concept. As such, Lancer ends up in the same tier as his dad. Next up is Mad Dummy, aka Mad Mew Mew, aka Napstablook's cousin. In terms of means, Mad Dummy has no arms as a ghost or as a dummy, but as Mad Mew Mew, they do have hands, and those hands actually include 5 fingers. It's entirely possible that Mad Dummy is possessing a similar doll in the Deltarune timeline, and given that Mad Mew Mew's body is literally an animatronic, that could be argued to be evidence of them being knight-like due to them effectively being a soul inside a metal body. Mad Dummy is also notable for wielding a knife, and while they are not a knight in Undertale, they do work alongside Undyne, who is a knight, and are noted for having a fondness for her, so this could be evidence of them having interest in knighthood. Mad Dummy is also an intensely passionate entity, which could be evidence of them having above-average determination. In terms of motive, Mad Dummy is a very passionate entity who is prone to bursts of irrational rage, so it could be argued that they are unstable enough to potentially pursue the path of the Roaring Knight. Furthermore, in the Deltarune timeline, both Mad Dummy and Mettaton are still living together, so it could be that Mad Dummy, seeing Mettaton in such a sorry state, wants to bring about the Roaring to make things better for their family. Alternatively, Mad Dummy hated Mettaton in Undertale, so maybe living together with him in Deltarune has driven Mad Dummy to the point of wanting to destroy the world out of rage. They are certainly extreme enough. Furthermore, if they really are possessing an animatronic like they were in Undertale, that would explain why the Spade King was so fond of them, as Mad Mew Mew is effectively a supernatural robot, which makes them quite different from the regular Lightners that the king hated so much. Furthermore, while it's hard to imagine many of these candidates overthrowing the Card Kingdom government and putting Spade King in charge, Mad Dummy seems aggressive enough to go for something like that, and I could totally see the Spade King respecting Mad Dummy's anger and rage. In terms of opportunity, Mad Dummy has the easiest time pulling off this scheme out of any of the other candidates thus far, as they can pass through walls in their ghost form in order to sneak into places or scout them out in advance before creating a dark fountain. As such, combined with them being very reclusive, Mad Dummy has every opportunity to create both the Card Kingdom and Cyberworld dark fountains without being detected. Overall, Mad Dummy is a shockingly valid candidate for being the knight. While possessing a robotic or even just metal body, they can meet all of the requirements necessary to match the knight's appearance, and they are one of the few characters known to use a knife. Throw in them having a personality that could lend itself to befriending the Spade King and pursuing the Roaring, their monster soul allowing them access to determination, and their ghostly nature allowing them to sneak around town, and I'd go so far as to say Mad Dummy is one of the strongest candidates on this list. The only thing that really holds them back is the fact that they have always been a rather minor character, so it's debatable if they are important enough to be given the role of the knight. That said, having the main antagonist be a supernatural ghost who cannot be harmed through normal means would definitely make for an interesting scenario. Plus, out of all the bosses that you fight in Undertale, the only characters who you fight multiple times in real, actual boss fights in a single run of the game are Asriel and Mad Dummy. Other characters like Undyne and Mettaton have additional fake boss fights, but you don't have to spare them or kill them to end those encounters. Asriel and Mad Dummy are the only ones who you have 2 full fights that end with you sparing them in both encounters. If you have as many fights with the protagonist as the main villain of the game, then that could be evidence of you being an important character. As such, overall, I would actually put Mad Dummy in A tier. I'm just as surprised as you are, honestly. Next up is Mad Dummy's more popular cousin, Mettaton. In terms of means, Mettaton is a ghost who lacks arms or hands, but if he were to possess a metal body, as he does in Undertale, then he could easily match many of the attributes of the knight, as we already discussed with the Mad Dummy. I will point out that unlike Mad Mew Mew, both of Mettaton's robotic forms have noticeably long arms, which certainly helps his case. Mettaton might also have enough determination to create dark fountains. That said, Mettaton has never wielded a knife as a weapon. In terms of motive, in this timeline, Mettaton has never achieved the fame and body that he always wanted, with his Neoform remaining an unfulfilled dream that he left on the public laptop. As such, if his life is so dull and disappointing, it seems entirely feasible that he might become the Roaring Knight in order to bring about a more entertaining world. Furthermore, people transform when entering the Dark World, so maybe Mettaton is only able to achieve his ideal body while in the Dark World, and thus he's bringing about an age of darkness in order to ensure he'll always get to live in his body. Mettaton was never a super ethical person, and while he's not a villain, I could definitely see him letting his hopes and dreams blind him enough to pursue a path as dangerous as that of the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, like I said with Mad Dummy, ghosts would have a hilariously easy time sneaking into buildings and scouting out opportunities to create dark fountains, and given that Mettaton is a recluse that nobody ever sees, his sneaking about would likely go completely unnoticed. Similarly, Mettaton's flashy nature and the fact that he's a ghost instead of a regular Lightner could allow him to bedazzle the Spade King into helping him with his plan. That said, Spade King respecting Mettaton doesn't make quite as much sense as Spade King respecting Mad Dummy. Overall, Mettaton has most of the same advantages that Mad Dummy had, which makes him a fairly strong contender to be the knight. However, there were definitely a handful of details that made Mad Dummy a bit more compelling and believable, which Mettaton doesn't possess. Namely, Mettaton seems less likely to befriend the Spade King, he has never wielded a knife, he wasn't able to acquire a body he was willing to inhabit without the help of Alphys in Undertale, and whereas Mad Dummy was a side character that I could see Toby Fox giving a larger role in Deltarune, Mettaton was a major character in Undertale, so I feel like he has already been given his time in the sun. As such, while this might be my personal bias bleeding in, I just don't feel as compelled by this option as I was with Mad Dummy, so I think I'm going to go ahead and put Mettaton in B tier. Next up is Monster Kid. In terms of means, Monster Kid has no arms or fingers and is never seen wearing armor or using a knife. They do seem to have above average determination, as they're willing to stand up to Undyne and Frisk in Undertale, and you could argue that they have a connection to knights due to them idolizing Undyne, but that doesn't quite make up for their other shortcomings as a candidate. In terms of motive, Monster Kid has a fairly pleasant and amicable persona, and they never really seem to want much of anything other than to live up to the people they idolize. As such, given that they generally idolize fairly heroic characters, it seems highly unlikely that they would want to pursue the Roaring. The only way you could spin this is by using the Goner Kid as evidence that Monster Kid has some greater meaning in the story, but given how much of a stretch that is, and how little we know about Goner Kid and his role in the narrative, even that route is dubious at best. In terms of opportunity, Monster Kid attends the school and has probably used the library before, so they could have likely snuck in at any point. There's no proof that they made these dark fountains, but there's no proof that they couldn't have made them either. You know, aside from the fact that they don't have arms. Overall, Monster Kid is one of Kris's classmates, which means they're likely more important than most of your average monsters, but they don't match the knight's attributes at all, they don't seem to have any motive to bring about the Roaring, and we've seen no evidence of them being anything more than some silly teenager trying to live their life. Plus, they have no arms, and that's a pretty big problem when it comes to being the knight. So, Monster Kid goes in F tier. I just noticed that 2 of Kris's classmates don't have arms. Wait, I forgot about Snowy. That makes it 3. How strange. This reminds me of that one Doofenshmirtz meme where he's like, it's strange that it happened more than once. Anyway, I digress. Next up is Muffet. In terms of means, Muffet has fairly long arms and could have above average determination, but she does not use weapons or armor, she has nothing to do with knights, and it's unclear if she has fingers or how many she possesses if she does. In terms of motive, Muffet is a capitalist through and through, so it stands to reason that if she thought she could make a world where her and her spiders could be more successful, it's conceivable that she could become the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, Muffet hasn't even been introduced as a character in Deltarune thus far, and given her status as a guest character who was put in the game as part of the Kickstarter, it's quite possible that Toby Fox has no interest in having her appear at all, much less making her the main antagonist. Even if she does live in town somewhere, we don't know what her relationship is with the school or the library, so it's completely impossible to tell how feasible it is for her to have created the two dark fountains that we encounter. Overall, Muffet is a rather minor character in the grand scheme of things, so combined with her missing several of the knight's attributes and her having yet to appear or even be mentioned in Deltarune, I find the idea of her being the knight extremely dubious. That said, she does have a couple of the knight's traits and the right mindset to conceivably pursue this path, so I'll put her in C tier. Next up is Mr. Elegance. I debated including this character, but he's literally a knight, so I had to at least mention him. He has no arms, no armor, no weapons, and is a Darkner who never fights anybody, so it seems pretty unlikely that he could have stolen the determination of some Lightner. That said, he is a knight. He's literally a knight chess piece, so he's one of the few confirmed knights in this game. In terms of motive, Mr. Elegance seems pretty happy to help out the Delta Warriors and is unhappy with the Spade King rising to power, combined with the fact that nobody calls him out as the knight, and it seems distinctly unlikely that he is the knight or has the motivation to pursue the Roaring. In terms of opportunity, he certainly could have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain as he lives there, but since we see him immediately before leaving to go to the library, it seems extremely unlikely that he could have beaten Kris and Susie there in order to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. Overall, I really probably shouldn't have bothered including this character as he lacks the means, motive, and opportunity to be the Roaring Knight, but I just felt obligated to mention him since he is technically a knight. He's going straight into F tier for obvious reasons. Next up is Mr. Society. In terms of means, he has no weapons, armor, or fingers, he is a bishop and not a knight, he is a coward who is afraid of the Spade King, and he seems to distinctly lack any form of determination. In terms of motive, Mr. Society loves to tout his superior intellect, but is too scared of the world around him to really do all that much. Maybe that fear could work as motivation to bring about the Roaring, but I find it hard to believe that he would be capable of overthrowing the other kings and putting the Spade King, a man Mr. Society dislikes, in charge. In terms of opportunity, this is the one place where Mr. Society shines, as not only did he live in the Card Kingdom, but he is specifically seen leaving the castle town before Kris and Susie, which could absolutely give him the head start needed to get to the library and create the cyber world. The fact that Mr. Society has the opportunity to create both dark fountains is rather unique among Darkners, and is the only reason that I included him in this analysis. Overall, as you'd expect, Mr. Society lacks the means and the motive to be the Roaring Knight, but he could have theoretically been in the right place at the right time to create the Dark Fountains, which counts for something. It doesn't count for a ton, mind you, I'm still putting him in D tier, but I do think he's been given just enough characterization and screen time to just barely get out of F tier. Next up is Napstablook. In terms of means, Napstablook falls behind the other ghost characters, as Napstablook has never possessed any physical form, nor have they ever shown any desire to acquire one. As such, as far as we know, their ghost form is the only form they ever bother with. With that in mind, Napstablook does not have armor, weapons, arms, fingers, anything to do with knights, and seems to possess less determination than most characters due to them constantly crying and being an introvert. In terms of motive, it's vaguely possible that Napstablook may want to pursue the Roaring in order to help their family, but unlike Mettaton and Mad Dummy, Napstablook has consistently shown to not only be a non-violent and non-confrontational person, but also one who is generally polite and kind to others, which makes them opening dangerous dark fountains seem distinctly out of character. They're literally a police officer in this timeline, a job devoted to protecting the public, so they really don't seem to have the correct motivation to pursue the Roaring. In terms of opportunity, like the other ghosts, Napstablook has every chance to create the dark fountains due to their ghostly powers. That said, since Napstablook has a day job, they could have some potential conflicts in their schedule, so even in this category, Napstablook falls behind the other ghosts. Overall, Napstablook lacks the means and the motive to be the Roaring Knight, and they have less opportunity than the other ghosts due to them having to work as a police officer, which makes them so much less viable than their family members that it's actually kinda shocking. An argument could be made that Napstablook deserves F tier, but they could still theoretically possess a metal body and masquerade as a knight, which means that, in theory, they could have the means just like the other ghosts. However, since that goes against their established characterization, I can't factor that in as strongly as I did with the others. Honestly, you could put Napstablook in D tier, but I think they're ever so slightly more viable an option than that, so I'll put them in C tier. Next up is the latest and greatest addition to our party, Noelle Holiday. In terms of means, Noelle has no weapons, armor, or any connection to knights, and it's unclear if she has the necessary number of fingers. That said, the Queen seemed confident that Noelle had enough determination to create more dark fountains, so that part checks out. In terms of motive, something bad is clearly happening with Noelle's sister. Her father is currently dying in the hospital, and she has an unhappy relationship with her mother. As such, Noelle has plenty of reasons to want to shake up the status quo, and she expresses as much at the end of Chapter 2. The only issue is that Noelle doesn't seem like the kind of person to summon dangerous dark fountains in her school or around her friends. But then again, maybe the reason Noelle wanted to go with Susie to the closet at the start of Chapter 1 was because she wanted to be the one to go on a magical adventure in another world with Susie, and Alphys just sort of ruined her plans. However, if Noelle really is the knight, then this idea relies on her completely concealing this fact in all of her dialogue while playing completely dumb about the existence of dark worlds and how the combat within those worlds works. That's not impossible, but it would go against Noelle's general characterization up until now. In terms of opportunity, Noelle attends the school and thus has plenty of opportunities to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, and she is known to use the library, so her choosing to create a Dark Fountain there makes some sense. However, where this option starts to struggle is with regards to Noelle's placement in the computer lab. It seems certain that the knight created the Dark Fountain inside of this closet, so the fact that Noelle is in the middle of the room when we seal the fountain seems to contradict that conclusion. Furthermore, if Noelle really did create the Dark Fountain, then how did Berdly not notice? He was either with her the whole time or literally got there before Noelle, so it seems like Noelle would have been seen. Furthermore, given how obsessed with Noelle the Queen is, and given that the Queen seems to have potentially encountered the knight, it seems incredibly unlikely that she would be unable to figure out that Noelle is secretly the knight. The Queen literally says that the knight has taken its leave, so unless she's covering for Noelle, this seems to be evidence against Noelle being the knight. That said, maybe Noelle has a split personality. Maybe the Queen encountered this alternate personality of Noelle's that calls itself the Roaring Knight, and when Queen is trying to awaken Noelle's power, she's actually referring to Noelle's Roaring Knight personality. That would explain a lot of Noelle's behavior in the Snowgrave route. It would also explain why Noelle is surrounded by craters when we find her. Maybe her Roaring Knight persona woke up and wreaked havoc before going back to sleep. There's not much evidence for this split personality theory, and even if it was true, Noelle still doesn't match most of the Knight's attributes. As such, as cool as Noelle having an evil alternate personality would be, I don't think it's very likely, and that makes Noelle a pretty dubious candidate. She's clearly got something going on with her, and she could be the Knight, but it seems unlikely given the evidence we currently have, so I don't think I can put her any higher than C tier. Next is one of the stranger characters in this franchise, Onionsan. In terms of means, Onionsan has tentacles instead of arms, is too large to fit in a closet, is never seen using armor or weapons, and it's unclear how much determination they might have. They realistically don't match the Roaring Knight much at all. In terms of motive, Onionsan can't even remember their own name, so it's hard to tell what kind of motivation they might have for anything that they do. I honestly have no idea why they would become the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, Onionsan is literally too big to fit into any of the buildings where these dark fountains were created, so it seems downright impossible for them to have created them. And even if they did somehow make these fountains, it seems even more impossible that nobody would have seen them fleeing the scene. Overall, Onionsan is one of the most unlikely candidates in this video due to their huge size, their lack of humanoid proportions, and their memory loss. They are easily the least likely candidate thus far, so F tier for the Onion. Next up is the Great Papyrus. In terms of means, Papyrus has long arms, dresses in some sort of armor, and wants to be a member of the Royal Guard. But he doesn't use knives, it's unclear how many fingers he has, and it's also unclear how much determination he has, although he seems like the sort of person to have above average determination. In terms of motive, this is where things get dubious. Papyrus is rather naive, so it's conceivable that he could be manipulated into doing some bad things, but he's also a very good person who would never overthrow a government and put someone like Spade King in charge. Furthermore, while Papyrus is on the innocent side, he's not a moron, so I feel like he would realize creating these dark fountains is a bad idea that puts people in harm's way. Papyrus is a simple man with simple desires, so him becoming the Roaring Knight and somehow earning the respect of the Spade King just really doesn't make sense. In terms of opportunity, Papyrus has never left his house as far as we know, so it's extremely unclear if he would have had the chance to create the Card Kingdom or Cyberworld Dark Fountains. Even if he did have the chance, he's new in town, so why would he bother making these fountains in these particular places? And how could he do it without being seen? Stealth isn't exactly one of Papyrus's strong suits. And depending how new in town Papyrus is, he may have arrived too late to have been the one to create the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. Overall, Papyrus has background in knighthood and thus matches a few of the knight's characteristics, but he also never uses a knife, has no clear motivation for pursuing the Roaring, and he has had no clear opportunity to create the dark fountains that we've seen. The characterization of Papyrus really disinclines me to believe he is the Roaring Knight, and if he actually was the Roaring Knight, I feel like that would undermine the threat level of the Knight substantially, as Papyrus is an inherently goofy character. Overall, I'd put Papyrus in C tier, as he could technically be the Knight, but I think he has too many issues to be a particularly strong option. Next up is Queen. Queen has a metal body, which could be argued to make her knight-like. She has long arms, and while we never see her hands in clear detail, the images of her on the computer monitor depict her with 4 fingers, while the Giga Queen has 5 fingers. However, the queen never uses knives, and while royalty do have inherent ties to knighthood, the queen herself is never painted in such a light. She also clearly does not have any determination, as she has to rely on Noelle to create more dark fountains. In terms of motive, Queen wants to cover the world in darkness in order to make things better for the Lightners. She makes this point very clear. However, she abandons this plan at the end of Chapter 2, and since the night is almost certainly an ongoing threat, that seems to damage the idea of Queen being the night. Furthermore, the Queen is specifically noted for studying and imitating the night, which would be a weird behavior if she actually was the night. In terms of opportunity, Queen works surprisingly well. She was obviously in position to create the cyberworld, and she has clearly met several of the Card Kingdom Darkners before, which means she has been to their kingdom and thus could have created their Dark Fountain. However, the Spade King met the Knight and regarded it in high esteem, and yet he clearly does not identify the Queen as being that Knight, and in fact, he actually seems to find her rather annoying. There's also the possibility that the Queen, much like the King, was seen alongside the Knight at the same time. And if she really was the Knight, then why would she bother traveling all the way to the school to create her first Dark Fountain, instead of just creating one right where she already was in the library? This option also relies on the Queen completely fabricating all the information she has on the Knight in order to throw off the scent, which seems rather elaborate and convoluted. And if that wasn't problematic enough, she clearly had the Delta Warriors at her mercy by the end of Chapter 2, so why on earth would she surrender? Why abandon your plans when your opportunity to create more Dark Fountains is right in front of you? That doesn't make sense. Overall, Queen is very similar to Spade King, as she has the right mindset to pursue the Roaring, but she lacks many of the Knight's core attributes, she clearly does not have the ability to create Dark Fountains, and since she has been pacified by the end of Chapter 2, it seems distinctly unlikely that she'll continue to be a threat in the future. Throw in the fact that she surrendered when she was winning, and this option takes its final nail in the coffin. Queen ends up right alongside King in F tier. Next up is the lonely prince from the dark, Ralsei. In terms of means, Ralsei does not wield knives, does not wear armor, does not have particularly long arms, and does not have the knight class the way Susie does. That said, Ralsei is royalty, and royalty is associated with knights. He likely has at least 4 fingers if his body is similar to Asriel's, and if you've seen my theory video on Ralsei, then you'll know that I think it's exceedingly likely that Ralsei has access to determination due to his unique origin and connections with Asriel. Just the fact that Ralsei has displayed special powers would seem to suggest that he can do more than your average Darkner. In terms of motive, this is where things start to fall apart, as Ralsei has consistently been the driving force against the Roaring, and it is through his direct intervention that the Dark Fountains have been closed. It is his story about the Roaring that forces Berdly, Noelle, and Queen to give up on their endeavor to create more Dark Fountains. There is not a single character more devoted to stopping the Roaring than Ralsei, which makes the idea of Ralsei being the Knight pretty much impossible. Unless Ralsei is playing both sides and is both trying to stop the Roaring and cause the Roaring, then I really can't foresee Ralsei being the main antagonist of this narrative. I would sooner expect Ralsei to be the angel from the prophecy, as at least the angel seems to be against the Roaring if my Deltarune magic theory holds true. But even without that, Occam's razor insists that Ralsei is not the Knight. In terms of opportunity, Ralsei has the ability to travel through dark worlds and possibly even enter the light world, which would give him all the opportunity he needed to create the Dark Fountains that we've seen thus far. Maybe Ralsei didn't sense the Dark Fountain in the cyberworld, but instead just knew that it existed already because he's the one who created it. The only issue with this idea is that it would require Rousey to say goodbye to Kris and Susie in the castle town, somehow rush ahead of them to the library, hide in the closet, create the Dark Fountain, tell Queen that he is the Roaring Knight, leave the cyberworld, wait for Kris and Susie to arrive, and then re-enter the cyberworld while pretending to have just arrived. And he'd have to do all of this without letting the Queen realize that he is the Roaring Knight. That is so absurd that it also simply seems impossible. Overall, Rousey has some of the baseline attributes of the Knight, but he's not a perfect match in terms of appearance or weaponry. He has consistently presented himself as being against the Roaring, and he seems to have zero opportunity to create the cyberworld Dark Fountain. If Rousey didn't have arms, I'd probably put him in F tier. However, I think there's just barely enough wiggle room for Toby Fox to pull off some insane plot twists and somehow make Rousey the Roaring Knight. I think that is extremely unlikely, but Rousey is shrouded in mystery, so I have to at least consider the possibility. As such, I'll be putting Rousey in D tier. Next, I was going to discuss Reaper Bird, but now that I think about it, Reaper Bird is an amalgamate of nameless, generic monsters, and since they have no named counterpart in Deltarune like Crystal and Mutler, there's really no point analyzing them. So I won't. Sorry, Reaper Bird. Next up is a character who is disturbingly viable as a candidate for being the Roaring Knight. This character, by all rights, should not be the Knight, and yet it upsets me how much evidence has slowly piled up in favor of this potentially being the case. If you've been paying attention, you'll likely know who I'm about to discuss. It's time for Rules Card. Starting with means, Rules wields a bladed weapon, is a duke and thus has ties to royalty and knighthood, he has decently long arms and possesses at least 4 fingers, and if his shoulder pads are anything to go off of, he is wearing at least some armor. You might think Rules is too stupid and cowardly to possess high levels of determination, but unfortunately, I think there is some evidence in favor of him actually having determination. For one, Rules has this line that you can read when he's in your inventory, but the sentence gets cut off. However, if you look into the game files and look at the complete sentence, you can see that Rules is aware that he is being cut off by the game, as if he somehow knows about the limitations of text boxes. If Rules is aware of the attributes of his video game world, then that would make him similar to Flowey, who is another character with above average determination who also has awareness of them being in a video game. Throw in the fact that Rules can flat out teleport, can create devices that mind control other mini-bosses, and was seemingly about to unleash some sort of awesome power before he turned to stone, and this all culminates in Rules Card, much like Rousey, having supernatural powers that no other Darkners seem to possess, which could be hinting at him having determination. Also, do you want to see something horrible? This sign has Rules' signature on it. He signs it RK. Tell me, dear viewers, what could RK possibly stand for? Rules Card or Roaring Knight? Yeah, Rules literally has the same initials. Both names start with R and K. What the actual hell? If that wasn't enough, remember this one line that Sham has? It's clear from what Sham says that the remaining king puts someone and their strange son into power. We know that the remaining king is the Spade King, who is the father of Lancer. The most common interpretation of this line is that Sham is saying that the Spade King put himself and his son Lancer into power. Given that we then go on to see the Spade King and Lancer in charge of all the Darkners, this interpretation seems valid. The only issue is that you'd expect this line to be the remaining king put himself into power, and not the remaining king put him into power. As such, another interpretation of this line is that the him being referenced here is not the Spade King and is actually the knight. If that is the case, then that implies that not only did the knight have a strange son, but also that this strange son was put into power in the Card Kingdom. The only character other than the Spade King to have any power in the kingdom is Lancer, which means that this interpretation of this line implies that Lancer is the son of the knight. This also implies that the knight was put into some position of power in the kingdom. This doesn't really seem to make a ton of sense, as it's directly stated that Lancer's dad is the Spade King, who we know is not the knight. However, we also know that Lancer refers to Rule's card as his lesser father. And Rule's card also got put into power by the Spade King. As such, you could interpret this line as Sham saying that the Spade King put the Roaring Knight, Rule's card, and his strange son Lancer into power. Now, obviously, this interpretation has issues, as the Spade King's later dialogue clearly does not reference Rule's card as being the knight. But just the fact that this tinfoil hat conspiracy theory makes as much sense as it does is upsetting. In terms of motive, Rules is obsessed with serving under an evil overlord, and thus happily works for the Spade King and later the Queen until he is defeated. He is notably the only antagonist from Chapter 1 to return to confront the party a second time in Chapter 2. What does this have to do with the Roaring? Well, if my theory about Deltarune's magic and the angel holds true, then unleashing the angel's heaven will literally summon the angel from the prophecy to wreak havoc on the world. As such, since Rules is obsessed with serving the most powerful villain in the area, it makes sense that he'd try to summon a dark god to serve under. His actions further support this notion, as he is constantly finding ways to oppose the heroes. In the Card Kingdom, Rules does everything in his power in order to stop the Delta Warriors from reaching the Dark Fountain, and he only joins their side after all his attempts have failed. This could be because he wanted to stay close to his enemies and keep an eye on them in the event that they get in the way of his future schemes as the Roaring Knight. That could explain why he insists on joining their team at the start of Chapter 2. Lancer joining makes sense, he's a friend of Susie's. Starwalker joining makes sense, as he's the original Starwalker. But why would Rules want to join? It's almost like he knew they'd end up on some adventure in another dark world, and he stowed aboard in order to stop them in their quest. The absolute second that Rule's card arrives in the cyber world, he reconstructs the Thrash Machine with the help of the Sweet Cap and Cakes before lying in wait to ambush the Delta Warriors once they get close to the Dark Fountain in the Queen's Mansion. Rules only joins their side after he fails, just like last time. Honestly, this motivation works uncomfortably well with Rules card's actions and behavior thus far. In terms of opportunity, this is where this option thankfully starts to run out of steam. Rules was locked up in the Card Kingdom for some time, so while he could have theoretically created the Dark Fountain there, it doesn't really make sense how exactly Rules could have acquired a Lightner's determination. Furthermore, we literally see Rules jumping out of our pocket after we enter the cyberworld, which means that Rules' card was in our possession during the time when the Roaring Knight was creating the Dark Fountain in the library. As such, thank God, Rule's card could not have been in the right place at the right time to create this latest Dark Fountain. Overall, it is downright infuriating how much more viable of a candidate Rule's card is than most of the other characters. Toby Fox seems to have designed Rule's card with the specific intention of being a humongous red herring. I'm going to go ahead and call it now. At some point in a later chapter, we are going to find a note or a message that is signed with the initials of RK, and the heroes will all think it's from the Roaring Knight, only for it to actually turn out to be Rule's card. That is the only reason I can think of, aside from sheer coincidence, for Toby Fox to have given this character this ridiculous name. I'm not putting Rule's card in A tier, because obviously he's not the Roaring Knight, but I can't deny the similarities he has to said knight. Just the fact that their initials are the same is completely unique to Rule's card. As such, it is with a heavy heart that I put him in B tier. Please understand, I would love nothing more than to put him lower. Next up is the final holiday on this list, Rudy Holiday. In terms of means, Rudy has decently long arms, probably has fingers, is the best friend of Asgore, who was a knight and a king in a previous timeline, and Rudy also seems like a fairly strong-willed individual. However, Rudy has never been depicted with weapons, armor, or anything remotely knight-related. In terms of motive, much like Noelle, Rudy's family is in disarray, so he may have a desire to shake things up and improve his family's lives before he passes away. He plans to go to church in Chapter 3, and he literally has an angel doll in his hospital room, so him wanting to bring about the angel's heaven for religious reasons could also make some sense. The only downside is that Rudy would never put his daughter at risk by putting these dark fountains in the school and the library, so that is a pretty notable issue with Rudy being the knight. In terms of opportunity, Rudy is currently bedridden in the hospital, which probably prevented him from creating the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, and definitely prevented him from creating the Cyberworld Dark Fountain. Rudy is one of the few characters trapped in a specific room for 24 hours a day, which largely hurts his ability to be in the right place at the right time to be the Roaring Knight. Overall, Rudy matches a couple of the knight's traits and may have the right motivation, but his care for his daughter, combined with his illness trapping him in the hospital, makes it very unlikely that he could actually be the Roaring Knight. It's not completely impossible, so I won't put him in F tier, but he's as D tier as they come. Side note, I won't be discussing the Mare, despite her being an important character for Rudy and Noelle, because we know basically nothing about her at this point in time. Next up is Mr. Undertale himself, Sans. In terms of means, Sans has never dressed like a knight, does not use knives, has short arms, has an unknown quantity of fingers, and has an unknown quantity of determination. Normally, given how powerful he is, I would assume Sans has above average determination, but his own dialogue on the topic seems to imply that he does not consider himself to have a particularly high quantity of determination. And the only vague connection Sans has to knighthood is the fact that he was employed by Undyne as a sentry and his brother wants to join the Royal Guard, but that's still pretty weak evidence. In terms of motive, Sans is a deeply mysterious character, but what we do know is that he cares about his friends and his brother. He is generally a laid-back and friendly guy, and he takes his promises extremely seriously, to the point that he's unwilling to stop Frisk unless the world will literally be destroyed if he doesn't. That said, he does take his responsibilities seriously enough to do the bare minimum, as Undyne puts it, and he would have happily killed Frisk if he hadn't made a promise not to. As such, as far as ethics are concerned, Sans has a very particular attitude. He will happily kill children, but he would never break a promise, even if his brother is murdered. This combination of ethical ambiguity and extreme loyalty could easily work as motivation for him becoming the Roaring Knight if someone close to him asked him to do it. If he thought creating dark fountains would benefit Papyrus, I could definitely see him pursuing this path. In terms of opportunity, Sans has only recently arrived in town, so it's debatable if he could have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain. Similarly, he has a day job working at his store, so it's unclear if he could have been in the right place at the right time to create the cyberworld. In Undertale, Sans could teleport, so if he still has that power in Deltarune, then it would be child's play to create these fountains, but we have no proof that Sans still possesses this ability. Overall, Sans is a very interesting character, and I wouldn't blame people for wanting him to play a larger role in the narrative, but I sincerely doubt he will. Sans has never liked the spotlight, so him becoming the Roaring Knight seems very out of character for him. Combine that with him failing to match any of the Knight's attributes, and it being unclear if he has ever had the opportunity to create the Dark Fountains, and I think it's safe to say that Sans probably isn't the Knight. He is a mysterious character, so I won't say it's outright impossible, but I don't think I can rank him any higher than D tier. He's definitely a less believable option than Papyrus. Next up is Sham. In terms of means, Sham has acquired many random items, including weapons, so it's entirely possible that they have a knife or a suit of armor. However, Sham has an unknown quantity of fingers, was a court magician and not a knight, and given how apathetic they are, I find it unlikely that they have any amount of determination. Then again, Sham was able to defeat Jevil, so maybe they are powerful enough to steal a Lightner's soul. In terms of motive, Sham has a distinctly nihilistic view of the world, and doesn't think anything really matters in the long run. They specifically state that they don't care if the Delta Warriors seal the fountain, because neither light nor dark holds a future for a Darkner in their condition, which seems to be proof that they don't care enough to bother becoming the Roaring Knight. Throw in the fact that Sham regularly helps out the heroes, and it seems distinctly unlikely that they have the right attitude to be the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, Sham could have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, but since we leave them in the castle town before heading to the cyberworld, it seems exceedingly unlikely that Sham could have beaten them there and created a Dark Fountain. Throw in the fact that Sham never seems to leave his shop, and it seems unlikely that Sham could have had the opportunity to create either Dark Fountain. Overall, Sham doesn't really match the Roaring Knight's attributes, doesn't seem to have the right motive to pursue this path, and doesn't seem to have had the chance to create the cyberworld. Throw in the assistance that they provide the heroes, and the fact that they talk about the Knight like they're a different person, and it just generally seems unlikely that Sham could be the Roaring Knight. Sham has enough power, knowledge, intelligence, and nihilism to potentially walk this path, so I don't think this option is completely impossible, but I do think Sham is a D tier candidate at best. Next up is Chara, aka Lemon Bread. Chara, as a fish, fails to meet even the most fundamental details necessary to match the Knight. She has no fingers, arms, armor, weapons, or any sort of association with knights. She may or may not have possessed above average determination, although she is labeled as brave on her tombstone. In terms of motive, we know next to nothing about Chara, so it's not really feasible to predict whether she could have reasons to bring about the roaring. In terms of opportunity, Chara is dead, so that hurdle pretty much guarantees that she could not be in the right place at the right time to create these dark fountains. In short, Chara is a dead fish who matches none of the knight's attributes, has no known motivation to bring about the roaring, and is currently dead, which largely makes this option impossible. Right to the bottom of F tier for her. I only bothered including her because they were one of the few named characters to become an amalgamate. Next up is the musical fish sister who is not dead, Chiron. Now, on her own, Chiron also doesn't have arms, knives, armor, or any of the things needed to be the knight. However, as we saw in Undertale, she sometimes disguises herself as a larger monster by floating above the body of her agent. As such, when combined together, Chiron and her agent could potentially have arms and fingers and weapons and so on. We never see them using such things, but it is at least possible. That said, she does seem to possess below average determination. In terms of motive, Chiron's sister is dead, and Chiron herself has always been somewhat ashamed of her singing voice. As such, maybe she wants to bring about the roaring in order to improve her own life, or something along those lines. It's not the strongest motive out there, but there might be something you could swing with her. In terms of opportunity, Chiron could theoretically have created the Card Kingdom Dark Fountain, but since she is resting in the hospital in Chapter 2, that may give her an alibi that proves she couldn't have created the cyberworld. That said, there is one detail of note that could hint at Chiron holding a greater position of relevance than you might have expected. I mentioned earlier that Onionsan heard a song from underneath the lake, and the same day we hear about this, Chiron can be found in the hospital recovering from overusing her singing voice. This seems to imply that Chiron was in the underground facility and that she was singing so loudly that Onionsan was able to hear her in the lake. This strained her throat so badly that she ended up in the hospital. Or so it seems. If that really is the case, then that could mean Chiron plays a larger role than we previously suspected, which actually makes sense. In Undertale, the river person talked about the song from the sea, which is the same song that Onionsan heard under the lake. And yet, in Undertale, nobody ever figured out what the song from the sea could be. This song will clearly play a larger role in Deltarune than it did in Undertale, but I refuse to believe that Toby Fox would hint at it in Undertale and not have some sort of answer in that game. This brings me to Chiron. In the fight with Chiron, which is an unavoidable encounter, you can keep singing with her, and it leads to this huge sequence in which a concert forms around you and which Sans himself shows up and starts selling tickets. Why would Toby Fox give this massive sequence to such a minor character? Well, maybe it's because she's not so minor after all. I wrote down the notes that she mentions in her battle, and I took the audio of her singing when she attacks you, and after repeatedly editing that audio and recreating her song with different instruments, what I found is that the song she is singing has no resemblance to any other song in the game. I think this song, Chiron's song, is the song from the sea, and that she holds some important position in the plot. I don't think that proves she's the knight, but I do think it proves she is something. Overall, Chiron really isn't that much better of a match for the knight than her sister was. The only advantage Chiron has is that she's alive and might have some connection with the underground facility. But even that doesn't make up for her distinct lack of means, motive, and opportunity to be the Roaring Knight. As such, she goes right down into F tier with her sister. She's literally a fish, after all, and while I think a fish can be important, I don't think a fish can be a knight. Unless that fish is humanoid, but we'll get to the humanoid fish later. Next up is the final bird in this video, Snowy. In terms of means, much like the other Snowdrakes, Snowy doesn't have fingers, arms, or any noticeable connection to knives or armor or knights, and it's unknown if he possesses any notable amount of determination. In terms of motive, Snowy had a very unhappy home life in Undertale, and that was only resolved by the intervention of Frisk and the return of Crystal in the form of an amalgamate. In the Deltarune timeline, that can't happen, so it stands to reason that he may still have an unhappy home life that is pushing him towards more extreme paths, such as becoming the Roaring Knight. He is also one of Kris's classmates, so it would make sense if he held some greater relevance in the plot. In terms of opportunity, Snowy attends the school and thus could have created the Card Kingdom, and although we never see him at the library, we also receive no evidence proving that he couldn't have been at the library at the time that the cyber world was created. As such, he could very well have had the chance to do what the knight has done. However, overall, Snowy is a comical side character who doesn't match the knight's physical description at all, and that hurdle is unfortunately a bit too much to overcome. The knight has hands, Snowy does not, so he goes down into F tier with the other Snowdrakes. Side note, I won't be ranking Snowy's dad, as he was an extremely minor character in Undertale, and an even more minor character in Deltarune, and there's nothing more to be said about him than what has already been said about Chilldrake, Crystal, and Snowy. Next up is the man, the myth, the big shot, Spamton. In terms of means, Spamton has even shorter arms than Kris, has an unclear quantity of fingers, does not wear armor or use weapons, and is not associated with knights. On the upside though, he owns a store where he sells weapons and armor, which could include knives, and he does seem to be rather determined. He is literally the character who introduces the idea of stealing the souls of Lightners. Although, since he failed to steal Kris's soul, it does seem unlikely that he has successfully stolen anyone else's soul. In terms of motive, Spamton makes his intentions perfectly clear. He wants to steal the soul of a Lightner in order to do something involving heaven. And who else is known to be involved with heaven? The Knight, who is going to bring about the Angel's Heaven. The pieces line up shockingly well in that regard. In terms of opportunity, Spamton has more grounds to be the knight than you'd expect. Sham knows who Spamton is, which implies that Spamton has visited the Card Kingdom before. As such, Spamton could have potentially had the opportunity to create their Dark Fountain. He also lives in the cyberworld, so maybe he could have created their fountain as well. The only issue with this idea is that if Sham and the Queen both already know who Spamton is, then why wouldn't they recognize him as being the knight? Furthermore, if Spamton had already stolen the soul of a Lightner before, then why does he have so much trouble stealing Kris's? Things don't quite seem to line up. And of course, like all the other secret bosses, Spamton is defeated and becomes a part of our inventory, while the knight is an ongoing threat, so that seems to hurt this option substantially. Overall, Spamton has the perfect motive, but he doesn't really have the right attributes, and his connections with Sham and Queen damage the validity of him secretly being the Roaring Knight. Throw in the fact that he has been vanquished and pacified by the end of Chapter 2, and this whole option falls apart. As such, while not as inconceivable as Jevil, I do think that Spamton is a D-tier candidate at best. Next up is Starwalker. These birds are pissing him off. He's the original Starwalker. Next up is Susie. In terms of means, Susie wears armor, is referred to as a Dark Knight in the menu, appears to have 4 fingers, and definitely seems to have a fair amount of determination. That said, she doesn't actually use a knife at any point, and she actively refuses to use any of Kris's swords. In terms of motive, it seems to be implied that Susie has an unhappy home life, as she never actually seems to want to go home. She's always hungry, which seems to imply that her family doesn't feed her, and when Toriel tells her to call her family and let them know that she's staying over, she fakes it for a second, but then doesn't do it. Given her connection with Lancer and the fact that she has so much in common with the Spade King, and I'm inclined to think that she also has an abusive father in her life who caused her to be the way she is. With this backstory, it makes perfect sense that she'd want to create more dark fountains. She even tells Kris that she wants to bring the Darkeners to the Light World, despite everything that Rousey said about the Roaring. As such, Susie has a well-established motive for being the Knight. In terms of opportunity, this is where Susie being the Knight starts to fall apart. For one, Susie is one of the most blunt and straightforward characters in the game, so the idea of her concealing anything, much less the fact that she's the Roaring Knight, is completely unbelievable. Throw in the fact that she's with us for the entire time when the Knight is supposed to be creating the cyber world, and Susie pretty handedly gets eliminated as an option. Overall, Susie is actually one of the better fits to be the Knight, as she has almost all of the Knight's attributes on top of having a very clear motivation for pursuing this path. However, the evidence seems to prove that Susie could not have been in the right place at the right time to do what the Knight is known to have been doing. As such, while Susie being the Knight is far from impossible, the idea has too many major flaws to be particularly compelling, which lands Susie in D tier. Next up is Swatch. In terms of means, we never see Swatch's hands. They don't wear armor or use weapons. They are a butler and not a knight, and while they do have a past working with Lighteners, there is no implication that Swatch has ever tried or succeeded in stealing a Lightener's soul, which means they almost certainly don't have access to determination. In terms of motive, Swatch is a loyal servant of the Queen who actively manages her estate and keeps ne'er-do-wells like Spamton and Rule's Card from causing trouble. While there may be some thin layer of exasperation in Swatch's service, they never demonstrate any sort of disloyalty to the Queen, and when the Delta Warriors bring Swatch to the castle town, Swatch shows loyalty to them as well. Given that the Roaring Knight is opposed to the Delta Warriors, you'd think Swatch would make a greater effort to oppose or at least not help the heroes if Swatch really was the Roaring Knight. In terms of opportunity, Swatch has never been known to visit the Card Kingdom, and even if they created the cyberworld, Swatch knows the Queen, and thus the Queen would likely recognize that Swatch was the Roaring Knight. As such, it seems distinctly unlikely that they had the opportunity to do what the Knight has done. Overall, Swatch fails to match the Knight's attributes, generally doesn't seem to have any motive for bringing about the Roaring, and also doesn't seem to have had the chance to create the Dark Fountains. Admittedly, Swatch is a very minor character with much less relevance to the plot than someone like Sham, so much of their character is too shrouded in mystery to really make a confident declaration on their viability for being the Knight. As such, since so much about them is unknown, I'll put Swatch in D tier instead of F tier. Next up is Swatch's female counterpart, Tasque Manager. In terms of means, Tasque has 4 fingers, but she doesn't actually have arms, which contradicts with the Knight, who is clearly depicted with arms. That said, she seems metallic enough to be considered wearing armor, and she seems very determined to maintain order in the mansion, although she doesn't use a knife. In terms of motive, Tasque Manager is exclusively devoted to maintaining order, and since the Roaring is said to bring chaos and devastation, it seems exceedingly unlikely that she would pursue such an endeavor. In terms of opportunity, Tasque Manager lives in the cyberworld and thus could have created their dark fountain, and she clearly recognizes Jevil, which implies that she has visited the Card Kingdom before and thus could have created their dark fountain as well. However, since the Queen seemingly met the Knight and Tasque Manager is literally the Queen's maid, it seems exceedingly unlikely that the Queen would fail to realize that Tasque Manager is the Roaring Knight. Overall, Tasque Manager meets a handful of the Knight's attributes and may have had the opportunity to create dark fountains, but her devotion to order and opposition to chaos directly contradicts with the path of the Roaring Knight, and pretty strongly implies that she is not them. While she has more connections than most, she has enough problems to only deserve D tier. Next up is Temmie. In terms of means, Temmie did sell some sort of super armor in Undertale, and she definitely has very long legs, but she has paws instead of hands, does not have fingers, does not wear armor or use knives, and has an unclear quantity of determination, although she is studying extra hard. In terms of motive, Temmie just seems to want to go to college, and given how generally straightforward and simple the Temmies are, I'm inclined to believe this motivation, which means she doesn't really have any reason to pursue the Roaring. In terms of opportunity, Temmie attends the school and has been seen at the library, so she seems to have had the chance to create these dark fountains if she so desired. Overall, Temmie is a silly joke character who doesn't match the Knight's attributes and doesn't seem to have any reason to pursue the Roaring. As such, given her flaws and overall insignificance, I'm inclined to put her in F tier, but I'll settle for D tier. Next up is Toriel. In terms of means, she doesn't wear armor or use weapons, she has never been a knight, she doesn't use a knife on screen at any point, and we never actually see how many fingers she possesses. That said, it's probable that she has 5 fingers just like Asgore and Asriel, and given that she's a boss monster, she probably has above average determination by default. In terms of motive, Toriel is a distinctly conservative and religious woman, as she had both her children regularly attending church, and she has the Deltarune plastered all over her house. She literally wears that symbol on her robe in Undertale. As such, it could be that she wants to bring about the angels' heaven for religious reasons. However, this all largely goes against her overall characterization. Toriel was the first character to teach us the importance of non-violence in Undertale, and she desperately did everything in her power to protect the lives of children. As such, the idea of her creating dangerous dark fountains in the school and library where her children and students attend seems obscenely out of character for her. Toriel has never believed in committing evil for the sake of the greater good, and she seems to have a fairly happy home life, so the idea of her being the Roaring Knight does not seem to line up with her character. In terms of opportunity, Toriel works at the school and is noticeably absent during the time when the Knight is creating the cyberworld. However, given that Kris's cell phone doesn't work in the Dark World, it seems likely that Toriel's phone wouldn't work either. As such, the fact that you can call Toriel at any point during your walk to the library seems to confirm that she is not in the Dark World, and thus cannot be the one creating the cyberworld. Furthermore, if Toriel had created this dangerous dark fountain in the library only for her child to call her and tell her that they are heading towards that library, wouldn't she try to discourage them from going there? The fact that she doesn't seems to imply that she didn't create that dark world. Overall, Toriel is a pretty terrible match for the Roaring Knight. Outside of her fingers and above-average determination, Toriel does not possess most of the Knight's attributes. Her morality and non-violence seem to oppose the idea of bringing about the Roaring, and the fact that you can call her seems to prove that she couldn't have been the one creating the cyberworld. As such, I am sorely tempted to put her in F tier. However, Considering how Deltarune seems to parallel Undertale in many ways, and since Asgore was the main antagonist of that game, it would definitely be up Toby Fox's alley to flip the script and have Toriel be the main antagonist instead. She was the first boss you fought in Undertale, so why not have her be the last boss you fight in Deltarune? Since that idea seems interesting enough to be conceivable, I'll go ahead and put her in D tier instead of F tier. Next up is the current Chief of Police, Undyne. In terms of means, Undyne seems to have 4 fingers. She was the leader of the Royal Guard in Undertale and thus wore armor, used weapons, and was tied to knighthood, and she was rather famous for being the most determined of all monsters, to the point that she could resurrect herself from death. And while she never used a knife in combat, she did own a giant sword, and it's implied that she was a fan of using all sorts of weapons. In terms of motive, Undyne was willing to kill children in Undertale, so it's not impossible to imagine her being persuaded to become the Roaring Knight if she thought she had to in order to save her people. However, she is also a fairly ethical person, and she takes her job of protecting her people extremely seriously. She's literally the chief of police, which means it's her job to protect this town. As such, the idea of her creating dark fountains in the school and library and endangering the very children she is supposed to protect seems very out of character for her. In terms of opportunity, it's entirely possible that Undyne created the Card Kingdom, but the cyber world is another matter entirely. It's true that she's hanging out just outside the library, which would definitely seem to put her at the scene of the crime. But she says herself that she had been directing traffic when this traffic jam occurred. This is corroborated by several other characters, including the appearance of the annoying dog. As such, if Undyne has been busy directing traffic this entire time, then it's not really possible for her to have been creating the Dark Fountain in the library. In fact, her being the chief of police means she pretty much always has eyes on her, which means it's hard for her to ever sneak off and create dark fountains. That said, there is the matter of her being called by Toriel at the end of Chapter 2. Notably, Undyne never seems to arrive, so this could be hinting that she was off doing Roaring Knight stuff when Toriel called. But then again, Toriel never uses Undyne's name, so it's possible that she was speaking to Napstablook. Alternatively, there is a small time skip where it transitions to Toriel being asleep. I highly doubt that Toriel would just go to sleep without first talking with the police, which inclines me to think that we simply don't get to see the scene where Toriel and Undyne talked. If I were to guess, Undyne probably investigated, found nothing, talked to Toriel, and then promised to watch over the house for the night. I wouldn't be surprised if Undyne was sitting outside, possibly having fallen asleep. As such, there really is no clear instance of Undyne sneaking off to do Roaring Knight things. Overall, Undyne is a certified knight in at least one timeline, and thus she could hypothetically match the attributes of the Roaring Knight. However, her personality and morality makes it exceedingly doubtful that she would pursue this path, and especially not in the way that the knight has behaved thus far. Throw in her lack of clear opportunity to create these dark fountains, and her chances to be the Roaring Knight seem pretty mediocre. That said, she's not a terrible candidate, she just has problems, so I'll put her in C tier. Next up is the vessel from the intro sequence. I wasn't originally going to talk about this one, but you guys brought it up in my community post on the topic, and you convinced me to give it some analysis. In terms of means, the vessel seems humanoid, so it likely has 5 fingers, and if Gaster is giving it a human soul, then that would imply it has determination. Unfortunately, that's about all the similarities with the knight that we can confirm. It seems to be about Kris's size, and Kris had notably short arms, and since this vessel is given no backstory, we have no way of knowing if it is associated with knights or knives or anything of the sort. In terms of motive, this entity is literally programmed by us during the intro sequence, so it's entirely feasible that it has no internal motivations on its own. Then again, if this is some sort of Pinocchio scenario, then maybe the vessel wants to bring about the roaring for a similar reason to Spampton. Maybe the vessel hates being a puppet whose choices don't matter, so it's trying to summon the angels' heaven in order to earn its own free will. Although, again, we really don't know. In terms of opportunity, this option has all the same problems as Frisk and Chara, as you'd expect a new human coming to town to catch some people's attention. This may be doubly true for the vessel, because if it looks like a goner, then it would stand out like a sore thumb. That said, the goners in Undertale could seemingly blink in and out of reality, so if the vessel can do that as well, then maybe it could just teleport into the library and the school in order to create these dark fountains. Hard to say. Overall, the vessel is an interesting option, and I can see why you guys would suggest it. We still don't know what the point of that intro sequence is, so having the vessel be the knight would finally fit it into the greater narrative of Deltarune. However, sadly, we know so little about the vessel that it's extremely difficult to judge what role or attributes it possesses. It could be a perfect fit for the knight, or it may have nothing to do with the knight at all. Furthermore, at the end of the intro sequence, they literally say that the vessel is discarded, so that could imply that this vessel that we create no longer exists. That said, since the vessel is such a mysterious entity, and since it could hypothetically fulfill many of the requirements necessary to be the knight, I'll go ahead and put it in B tier. I think it is about as likely to be the knight as Kris is, which is to say, I don't personally think the vessel is the knight, but it has a much better chance than most of the other characters. And last, but certainly not least, W.D. Gaster. In terms of means, the knight is heavily associated with hands, and Gaster is specifically known as the man who speaks in hands. He's also probably the person who invented the determination extraction machine, which means that if anyone could have artificially enhanced their own determination, it would be Gaster, which means he has a solid chance of being able to create dark fountains. However, that's about all the known similarities we can pinpoint. Gaster is extremely mysterious, so we have no idea if he was associated with knives, armor, knighthood, or even how many fingers he actually has. In terms of motive, this is where things get extremely speculative. Nobody really knows what kind of person Gaster was, or what reasons he might have for doing the things he does. Maybe he wants to bring about the roaring out of scientific curiosity. Maybe he wants to bring about the roaring in order to resurrect someone he cares about. Maybe he's a mad scientist who just wants to watch the world burn. Or maybe Gaster is a harmless old man who doesn't want to hurt anybody. We really have no idea. His depiction in the intro sequence with the Goner Maker could be foreshadowing of him being the knight, but it could just as easily be foreshadowing of a completely different plot twist. I will point out, in Undertale, Gaster created the core, which includes these pillars that are labeled Darkness Totems in the game files. Similarly, if you look at the pattern on the floor, it looks eerily similar to the double door entryways that lead into the dark worlds that we see in Deltarune. Combine that with Gaster famously talking about something being darker yet darker, and it could easily be argued that Gaster has some connection with the realm of darkness, which could work as evidence that he is the Roaring Knight, whose goal is to cover the world in darkness. In terms of opportunity, this is where I believe the evidence turns against Gaster being the Roaring Knight. It is generally believed that the person who messed up Jevil and Spampton was Gaster, and this is something that Sham talks about. Sham specifically says that Jevil met a strange someone. However, and this is important, when talking about the Roaring Night, Sham highlights their name in red. And yet, Sham does not do this for the strange someone that Jevil met. This seems to imply that Sham does not consider the Knight and Gaster to be the same person. Although, Sham does refer to both characters as strange, so that could be hinting that they're connected in some way. However, there's also the matter of the strange man who gives you eggs. We don't know if this man is Gaster. However, if he is Gaster, then that means this happy man in a car is also Gaster, which could be evidence that he is not the Roaring Knight, as he was stuck outside in this traffic jam during the time that the cyberworld was being created. Although you could argue that he created the cyberworld and then ran out to his car, so it's not concrete evidence. Outside of that, though, we really don't know when or how or if Gaster could have created these dark fountains. It's not impossible. He totally could have made them. We just know so little about him that it's difficult to judge. Overall, Gaster is so shrouded in mystery that it's extremely difficult to judge his candidacy for being the Knight. He is known as the man who speaks in hands, which could be faintly hinting that he's the Knight. But his name is not highlighted in red by Sham, which could be faintly hinting that he's not the Knight. His Undertale counterpart clearly worked on darkness-based projects, which could be evidence that he's the Knight, but he may just have been studying it to see how it works, and thus this might say nothing about him being the Knight. As such, overall, the evidence we currently have really just doesn't paint a clear picture one way or another. I personally do not believe Gaster is the Knight, as I've always gotten the impression that Gaster was a man who works from the shadows and doesn't really want to be in the center of attention. From a meta standpoint, I've always gotten the impression that Gaster is a character that Toby Fox wants to keep out of sight and mysterious. And if Deltarune parallels Undertale, I would not be surprised if Gaster just never directly appears in the plot at all. However, given that Gaster clearly plays an important role in this story, he is clearly tied to darkness, and his theme song is plastered all over Deltarune, and I cannot deny that Gaster is an incredibly strong contender. As such, I'll be putting him in A tier. And that is the full and complete ranking of all the possible candidates for being the Knight. Overall, while any of these characters could end up being the Knight, I think Chara, Father Alvin, Mad Dummy, and Gaster have a substantially higher chance than any of the others. Of course, as many of you have likely already considered, it's also entirely possible that the Knight is a brand new character who we haven't met yet. And you're right, I think that is absolutely a valid possibility. In fact, I even have a specific idea regarding who and what that brand new character might be. Which brings us to my theory. This theory of mine, like most of my theories, involves a fair amount of speculation. It also builds upon my previous theories, which means if those theories turn out to be wrong, then that would hurt this theory's chances as well. However, I still sincerely believe this theory has a high chance of being correct. So, who exactly do I believe is the Roaring Knight? Well, as I said, I think the Roaring Knight is a brand new character. However, This brand new character is deeply tied to many of the existing Deltarune and Undertale characters. In fact, I think the existence of this character as the Roaring Knight is an integral part of foreshadowing my Rousey theory. You see, I had a particular theory regarding exactly what Rousey was, and I still feel quite confident in my conclusion. However, many people found my logic to be too big of a leap. They needed more evidence, and the more I thought about it, if my Rousey theory was correct, then Toby Fox would need to foreshadow it much more directly in order for the audience to not feel completely bamboozled. If my Rousey theory is correct, then it will be one of the final big mysteries unveiled to the audience, which means we will need something major to push us in that direction ahead of time. And that major foreshadowing, I think, will be delivered by the Roaring Knight. Here's exactly how I think this is going to play out. When we finally confront the Roaring Knight, he will be this huge, bulky man wearing armor that looks suspiciously similar to Undyne. At some point during this confrontation, the knight will remove his helmet, and the face we see will be one that we instantly recognize. It won't be Undyne's face. It won't be Mad Dummy, Father Alvin, Gaster, or Chara either. It will be the face of Gerson. However, when he starts to speak and we see his character portrait appear, it won't be completely black and white like the Lightner's. Instead, his face will have faint bits of color, as well as a few new, distinct facial details that make him look different from the Gerson that we know. In fact, he will look like a younger version of the old turtle. How could this be? Well, let's break it down. Many people have theorized that Father Alvin is the Roaring Knight, as he has heavy ties to Deltarune and the Angel. However, while I think we are right to turn our attention towards Father Alvin, I think Toby Fox has very cleverly disguised the truth. I think Father Alvin is a red herring. But not just any red herring. I think Father Alvin is important for understanding who and what the Roaring Knight is, but I don't think he is the knight himself. If he was, I'm convinced he would have been given his own dialogue portrait and his own unique voice. Father Alvin is not the Roaring Knight, but he is responsible for the creation of the Roaring Knight. You see, as I discussed in my Rousey video, I believe that when an object coated in the dust of a monster is exposed to a dark fountain, a very special kind of entity is created. This entity possesses the powers of both a darkener and a lightener, and is thus incredibly powerful. So, what does this have to do with Gerson? Well, simple. Gerson died and thus turned to dust. Father Alvin, his son, then took Gerson's dust and spread it across Gerson's hammer. This hammer was imbued with the essence of Gerson Boom. However, through some unknown circumstances, this hammer found itself exposed to the power of a dark fountain. Maybe when Father Alvin buried Gerson's hammer, this hammer accidentally fell down into the facility that runs beneath the town. Maybe there is a dark fountain down there that brought this hammer to life. That would explain why Jevil associated the night with hell and with the underground. Or maybe Father Alvin is in on this plan and intentionally created a dark fountain in the underground facility in order to bring his father back to life. However, no matter what the exact circumstances were, instead of resurrecting Gerson Boom, what we instead got was the Roaring Knight. An entity with the appearance and mannerisms and memories of Gerson, but with a fundamentally different identity. This entity pondered its own existence, and pondered the memories of Gerson Boom, which it had inherited, in order to try and figure out the purpose for its creation. As it recalled the story of the angel, and all the research Gerson had done into the Deltarune, the knight came to a conclusion. He needed to bring about the roaring and achieve the angel's heaven. Why does the knight want to do this? There are many possibilities. Maybe it hates its own existence and wants to destroy the world. Maybe it is confused by its existence and wants to confront the angel in order to discover his purpose. Or maybe he has some other goal that's more noble and altruistic. Whatever the case, the knight would have access to the memories of Gerson, and thus would know of several places that would make for perfect spots to create dark fountains. For starters, Gerson was a teacher, and thus the knight had memories of this empty classroom, and chose it as the location of his first dark fountain. He then needed to put someone in charge of this new dark world to defend his dark fountain while he went off and created more. You see, as a scholar, Gerson likely stumbled across the legend of the Delta Warriors, and thus the knight knows about them as well. As such, he is likely aware that these warriors will come to seal his fountain. In order to prevent this, he looks for a Darkner willing to do his bidding. He finds the Spade King, a powerful Darkner so filled with hatred that he'd be willing to kill the Lightners on the knight's behalf. Seeing this opportunity, the knight overthrows the other kings and shares the legend of the Deltarune with the Spade King and assures him that this plan will create a world covered in darkness where Darkners can rule. It is because the knight shared this legend with the king that the king knows about the Delta Warriors at all. This is also why Lancer knows about this legend. During this scene, if you refuse to listen to Rousse's story, Lancer mentions that he is the teardrop-shaped Darkner from the legend. And yet, how could Lancer have known this image was featured in the story? Rouse wasn't literally showing pictures to Kris and Susie, so how did he know about this? He knew about it because the knight likely revealed this legend to the king and Lancer beforehand, and he either showed them pictures of the legend from one of Gerson's books, or he just assured them that a character like Lancer appeared in it. Furthermore, the king was more than happy to devote his loyalty to the knight because the knight wasn't actually a Lightner. The knight was, as far as the king was concerned, a super powerful Darkner that was going to bring about a utopia for his people. Of course he'd devote his loyalty to that. That's why the Spade King wields the Chain of Justice. The knight is literally the hammer of justice brought to life. That's also why the knight will wear armor that looks suspiciously similar to Undyne's armor. Undyne was heavily inspired by Gerson in the Undertale timeline, and thus she likely modeled her armor after Gerson's armor. That's why she wields the Spear of Justice, and now that the Spade King is also being inspired by the knight, it's why he wields the Chain of Justice. The knight would go on to create the Cyberworld Dark Fountain, and during that time he encountered Queen and called himself the Roaring Knight. The reason the knight chose this place was because, just like with the unused classroom, the knight had memories of the library. Gerson was a scholar and a writer after all, so it makes perfect sense that he would have visited this library frequently. However, unlike with the Card Kingdom, the knight didn't stick around to put someone in charge to defend his fountain. Why could that be? Well, I think the reason was because the knight accidentally created this dark fountain while Noelle and Berdly were in the computer lab. I think the knight felt threatened by the sudden presence of Lightners in his dark world, so he fled the scene before he could set up a new regime to defend his dark fountain. However, now that he has created a dark fountain in the library and the unused classroom, where was the knight going to create the next fountain? Well, Gerson's son is the priest at the church, so that would be a logical next location. However, everyone's going to church in the next chapter, so I think that may end up forcing the knight to go somewhere else. Figuring that the school had worked out before, I believe the knight's next dark fountain will be created in the other unused classroom. In fact, I think Spampton directly foreshadows this. Spampton mentions that they don't need easels or CRTs. CRTs is likely referring to CRT televisions, while the easels are a reference to the stands that artists paint on. I think these easels that Spampton is referencing are located in this classroom. I think this room is the art room for the school. As such, I think Chapter 3 will be us going through the dark world that Kris created in front of their CRT television, while Chapter 4 will be us going to this unused classroom and dealing with the dark fountain that the knight created. In order to wrap this particular theory up, let's take a look at the means, motive, and opportunity of this hypothetical character that I've dreamt up and see if he makes sense within the context of the evidence we have regarding the knight. We don't know what name the Roaring Knight calls itself, so I'll just call my theoretical character the Hammer, since I think he is a Darkner created from Gerson's hammer. In terms of means, the hammer should be physically extremely similar to Gerson, just like how Rouse is physically very similar to Asriel. As such, the hammer should have 4 fingers, decently long arms, and him having a shell could easily translate to him being knight-like in the dark world. Furthermore, since the hammer has Gerson's memories and mannerisms, he would share many of the attributes that made Gerson such a viable candidate. Namely, Gerson was a blacksmith who likely forged armor and weapons, he was a legendary hero in the Undertale timeline, and he was well known as the toughest monster to ever live. All these details together would definitely enhance the hammer's ability to fill the role of the Roaring Knight. Furthermore, as a Darkner infused with the power of a Lightner, the hammer could very well have the ability to create dark fountains. Or, alternatively, it could be that the hammer has stolen the soul of a Lightner in order to grant him this power. We've all been wondering what happened to Noelle Holiday, right? Well, maybe that's what happened to her. Maybe she was killed, and her soul was absorbed by the knight. Admittedly, she's not a boss monster, but maybe the souls of regular monsters can persist for a little bit longer if they die in a dark world. Other rules change in the dark world after all, so why not that one? In terms of weaponry, Gerson was a flawed candidate because his primary weapon was a hammer instead of a knife. But now that the hammer has become a Darkner, it would make perfect sense for this new entity to wield a different weapon. After all, Asriel never wielded a scarf as a weapon, and yet Rouse does. So why not have the hammer wielding a knife? Or even if the knight isn't using a knife as its primary weapon, the hammer, having the memories of Gerson, would give him more than enough expertise to forge a knife for him to use when creating dark fountains. But more importantly, as a scholar, Gerson was such a compelling candidate because he was one of the few people who had the expertise necessary to have potentially discovered the existence of dark fountains and the roaring during his studies. As such, thanks to having Gerson's memories, the hammer has inherited all that potential. In terms of motive, like I said before, the hammer could want to bring about the roaring for a variety of reasons. He could do it to understand his purpose, to take revenge on the world, or maybe even to save the world by bringing about the angels' heaven. There's plenty of options. Gerson, and by extension the hammer, are privy to far more information than we are, so it's likely that they have a better idea of what's at stake and what needs to be done. In terms of opportunity, this is where things get especially effective. Not only have all previous locations used to create dark fountains lined up perfectly with Gerson's experience as a teacher and a scholar, but those exact same memories inform us on where the future fountains will appear. As a special entity that can traverse the dark world and potentially use some sort of underground dark world in order to sneak about, it would be perfectly reasonable for the hammer to create these dark fountains without being noticed. In fact, considering that Ralsei completely vanishes when you seal dark fountains, it stands to reason that the hammer may be able to do the same. And if he can teleport, or turn invisible, or do whatever Ralsei does while in the light world, that would mean he runs zero risk of stumbling into any witnesses. Needless to say, if such an entity like the hammer truly exists, then he would match all of the known requirements of the knight, while also acting as a fantastic plot twist that nobody would see coming. Everyone will be expecting the knight to be Chara, or Father Alvin, or Gaster, or Kris, and then they'll be completely astonished to discover someone that looks exactly like Gerson. It would be a truly jaw-dropping reveal, and best of all, it would give the audience the first inkling as to what's truly going on with Ralsei. In short, my personal theory regarding who the Roaring Knight truly is that he is a special darkener created from the combination of the remains of Gerson Boom and the hammer he was buried with. This entity, wielding the memories of Gerson, would have the powers, the knowledge, and the determination necessary to bring about the roaring, while also being an entity that the king can respect, that the audience won't expect, and that can provide further hints towards the deeper emotional tragedy surrounding Ralsei. It would also make the knight a perfect foil for Ralsei, as they would both be special darkeners created from the remains of a monster, but with one of them fighting to bring about the roaring, while the other fights to stop the roaring. And this backstory would also fit into the theme of Deltarune perfectly, as the knight would have had no choice in his creation, no choice in his memories or appearance, and once he realizes the angel is not what he thinks it is, no choice in his ultimate destiny. Your choices aren't the only ones who don't matter. Kris, Ralsei, the knight, nobody's choices truly matter in this world. They're all just puppets on a grand stage. And with that, I think I've just about covered everything I have to say regarding the Roaring Knight. I hope you guys enjoyed this disgustingly long video. You may have noticed that I didn't bother with any dramatic flair this time around when presenting my personal theory on the hammer. I had some comments in the Ralsei video saying my dramatic presentation of that theory was cringy and obnoxious and overdramatic, which was hard to hear, I must say. I don't exactly have thick skin, but for every person calling me cringy, there was at least a few of you saying you appreciated the dramatic touch. So I hope you guys know I appreciate you. You kind people were the ones I was trying to entertain, so as long as you had fun, I'm satisfied. That said, I'm not quite ready to read 20 comments calling me cringe again, so I tried to tone it down for this theory. I'm still quite excited about it though, and I hope you guys found it interesting. Side note, if my theory is correct, then the knight may have a name that is an anagram of Gerson Boom, just like how Ralsei is an anagram of Asriel. If that's the case, then one option for what his name might be is Oberon Smog, which is a fantastic freaking name for a villain. Like, holy cow. It also has a ton of thematic significance for the Roaring Knight. Oberon was the king of the fairies in European folklore, and the knight is literally creating fantasy worlds. Plus, his fountains cover the world in black smoke that could easily be referred to as a smog. The Roaring Knight, Oberon Smog. I think it's pretty cool. But yeah, with that, I've finished another Deltarune video. I'm kinda shocked that I've managed to keep at this for so long. I'm thinking my next video will be about the truth of the shadow crystals. Although, if you guys have any better ideas for video topics, I would love to hear them. You suggested several interesting topics last time, so I'd love to hear more. Also, just allow me to say thank you all again for the incredible support. It really means a lot to me. I've never expected these videos to be as popular as they are. And with that, I think I'll sign off for today. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you've got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.